Good morning, everyone. We're now convened here in the Guildhall Council Chamber in Cambridge, which of course is vitally notable for its two originally women's colleges that were set up in Cambridge when women determined that our voices would be heard and that we would have an equal opportunity to an education, an equal opportunity as that education that young men of that era were allowed to receive in a particular class category, of course. Girton College was the first college set up, and Newnham College was the second college set up in Cambridge. And there is a distinction between the two, and I may sound somewhat chauvinist about Girton, but Girton determined that the women would do the tripos, which was the same examination series as the young men would do, even though the University of Cambridge refused to accept those two colleges as a part of the University of Cambridge when they were first set up, and even though the women would not gain acknowledgement for having done the tripos. Newnham did another set of examinations, but Girton determined it would do the tripos and that the women students would do exactly the same examinations as the young men at the colleges, albeit they would not gain recognition for it. Subsequently, of course, they did. I would also, in this opening, pay tribute to all those people in the Ukraine, women, children and men, who are in the struggle for the right to run their own country in the way that they wish to do so. I also pay tribute to those who are struggling through the floods in Mullumbimby and Lismore in Australia, suffering from destruction and death as they're suffering from destruction and death in Ukraine, and pay tribute to all those who lost their lives and were subject to destruction and death in the fires of Australia and California, and then in all the countries that are suffering, particularly as a consequence of climate change and the climate and biodiversity emergency. These are real. Now, this is a women's parliament, so I'm not going to do what is the tradition in other sorts of gatherings to say, let's have a minute's silence in remembrance and in connection and the wishes for their lives and their hopes of all those people in situations of disaster, man-made or natural disasters. Because it seems to me that what we need to do in these circumstances is speak and raise our voices high, not to be silent, but to speak up and speak out. So I do not call for silence, I call for voice. And I will be calling for voice the speakers, the members that we have of this historic Women's Parliament, whom I would like to introduce to you. Dr. Susan Buckingham is a researcher, writer and consultant on gender and environment, working with non-government organisations, universities, the European Union, United Nations and other international organisations. I will also give her a plug for her book. As a writer, I know how important it is that one does have recognition of one's work. Her latest book, Gender and Environment, looks at how gender relations structure environmental decision-making and action at all scales. Dr. Alex Bulat is a migration researcher and a migrant rights campaigner who became the first Romanian-born British Labour County Councillor in England in May 2021. Alex represents Abbey Division in Cambridge. She has worked on migrants' rights campaigns for over 5 years with various organisations, including on access to settlement and citizenship and residence-based voting rights. Shabina Begum is an international family law consultant solicitor at Dawson Cornwell and a lecturer in law at the University of Buckingham, specialising in gender-based violence, and she is a recognised United Nations authority on child, early and forced marriage. She was also part of the pro bono team drafting the child marriage bill. Debbie Brazil founded the grassroots campaign End Sexism in Schools in October 2020. This came about because she observed how her son's schools were simply reproducing patriarchy, almost unnoticed and unchallenged, not unnoticed nor unchallenged by Debbie Brazil and End Sexism in Schools, fortunately. The campaign demands include equal content about and time spent on women in the curriculum, so that thinking about women and girls is a part of the everyday and not simply part of International Women's Day. Nora Al-Ani is Director of Cambridge Rape Crisis Centre, a local specialist sexual violence organisation providing dedicated support services to survivors of rape, sexual abuse and any form of sexual violence. Nora has been at Cambridge Rape Crisis Centre for 12 years, with over 25 years' experience of working in the women's sector in Cambridgeshire. Nora was awarded an MBE, Member of the British Empire, in the New Year's Honours List in the year 2020 for her services to social justice and gender equality. Hannah Murphy is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Buckingham. She is a psychology PhD student at that university, and I must interpose with a personal note here, has been of particular assistance to me in my work at the University of Buckingham when we've been doing assessments of students in negotiation skills, for example, because I'm a lawyer, she's a psychologist, and in order to do an effective assessment, we need the legal expertise and we need the psychology expertise. So I thank Hannah Murphy for that. Clara Giroux is, as she says, Clara. She graduated from university with a degree in law with a specific interest in criminal and human rights law, and is currently working for Southampton City Council. She has also been a legal assistant in the CEDAW in Law group, that is, the group in relation to the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, in relation to which our motion today is put. Mrs. Eleanor Redshaw is a Girton graduate. She taught at a variety of schools and became head of geography and humanities at Greenacre School, Banstead. Her grandmother was a suffragette who was arrested and spent time in Holloway Prison. And you will see coming up on the screen when Eleanor Redshaw speaks, the image of her grandmother having chained herself to the rails of Buckingham Palace, being arrested by 3 burly police officers. And Eleanor is, when you will see her when she speaks, dressed in her grandmother's regalia from those wonderful times of the suffragette movement, brave women who were tortured in prison and then were released so that they could recover and then be taken back to prison again, to be tortured again by forced feeding. Natalie Turney is a lecturer in law at the University of Buckingham School of Law. Her principal areas of research are corporate and insurance law. And she said to me when I invited her to become a member of our Women's Parliament that her speciality, of course, is not in the area of women and the law. And yet, she immediately gave me an example, which she'll give to us today in this Parliament, of how corporate law and the laws in relation to that area are definitely of relevance to women and can be as equally negative and discriminatory as any other law that people ordinarily think of as women's law, quote unquote. Ella Betts. Ella Betts was previously a homeless woman in Cambridge. She uses her lived experience to help homelessness organisations and other services better understand how they can do more for homeless women, whilst also working closely with Women's Homeless Action Group to create Cambridge's first haven for women facing homelessness and domestic violence. Baljit Banger is the Executive Director of the National Umbrella Organisation, IMCAN. IMCAN supports the specialist by and for ending women against violence sector, the WAVG sector, working under an intersectional social justice framework. Baljit has worked for a number of years on women's rights and protections, and Baljit was one of the wonderful witnesses who appeared at the CEDAW People's Tribunal held in London online from the 21st to the 23rd of June last year, from which the President's report emanates, which is referred to in our motion. Saoirse Khan is a second-year history undergraduate at the University of Cambridge. Saoirse has a particular interest in modern history, and in the last year, Saoirse served as the co-chair of the Cambridge University Labour Club. Currently, she is their Speaker's Officer. Anne, or Annie Gilpin, is an activist in the disability movement. She is also active in the trade union movement in terms particularly of representing those with a disability. She is a journalist and works effectively and efficiently in her field. And always it is Annie, and we shouldn't have to rely on people to bring this to our attention, that this live stream on YouTube does have captions that one, if one wishes, can access. And it was Annie that brought this to my attention, and I pay tribute to her for having done that. I should have thought of it instantly myself. Jenny Stofa. Jenny is currently studying towards the bar examination with the Inns of Court College of Advocacy and hopes to work in human rights or family law. She previously worked in communications for several non-government organisations, most recently Amnesty International. She also is associated with the CEDAW in Law organisation as a legal assistant. Having given birth to her first child in June last year, she has first-hand experience of some of the issues women faced with maternity and birthing services. Abiola Arucci is a pupil barrister at 4-5 Gray's Inn Square, Chambers. She is the mother of 2 daughters and a feminist. She also, I must say with pride, is a graduate in law with first-class honours from the University of Buckingham. Debbie Allen. Debbie Allen is an anti-racist activist. She runs a regular online program, Let's Chat About Race, and she is an extraordinarily powerful speaker whom I had the great good fortune to meet over Zoom on a Stand Up to Racism meeting where we're all strictly on that, held to 2 minutes, I think, and if we go over the 2 minutes, off we're shut immediately. It's a wonderful, wonderfully disciplining exercise. But Debbie spoke on that, and as it was Debbie, was given longer than 2 minutes and spoke extremely effectively. So therefore I was able to invite her to speak to the Cambridge Labor Party over Zoom again. Claire J. Reeve. Claire lives in West Suffolk. She has a Bachelor of Arts and an NNEB, that is the Diploma in Nursery Nursing. She has worked within schools, libraries, Sure Start and children's social services. Claire strongly believes more recognition must be given to neurodiversity in women and girls, herself being ADHD and having an autistic teenage daughter. Claire has spent the last 4 years as a Labor Party Women's Officer and was recently a representative on the East Region Labor Executive Committee. Glenys Williams was an itinerant physics science teacher in different parts of the world, and she is now resident in Cambridge, working to produce physics and other science examinations at IGSCE and O level. She likes cats and dogs and dislikes straw men and disorganisation. She is a Star Trek fan, and I have to confess I am too, and I think Patrick Stewart is the best captain. Of course, the others have been excellent too. Anne Campbell. Now, Anne Campbell is a former Member of Parliament for Cambridge from 1992 to the year 2005, and she was extremely strong during the dispute and the disagreement over the war in Iraq, a tribute to women and a tribute to Labor and a tribute indeed to the world where we do not believe in war. She was previously a Cambridgeshire County Councillor from 1985 to 1989 and founded 2 organisations benefiting women, namely Opportunity Links and Cambridge Online, and worked closely with Harriet Harman, another wonderful woman, Member of Parliament, to promote childcare tax credits and working families tax credits. Ana Serrano is from Catalonia. She's a politics graduate and the Ask Me project coordinator at Women's Aid. She is a feminist and a social justice warrior. Bethany Howell. Bethany Howell is currently undertaking her Masters in International and Criminal Law. She aspires to become a barrister in the future. She is a supporter of the need for Women's Bill of Rights for the present and the future generations of women, and also has been a legal assistant to CEDAW in law. Chloe Gillandes is a 3rd-year law student at Anglia Ruskin University, advocating for young girls and women. And she especially is passionate about the importance of advocating for minority women in the field of education. Louise Matthews. Louise Matthews is a member of Back to 60 and of CEDAW in law. She has been engaged in the struggle to have the pension rights of women born in the 1950s to be recognised properly and effectively by the United Kingdom government. The United Kingdom government changed the rules without effectively notifying all the women who would be impacted. Now, I have to say I take issue with the decision of the courts in this country that the government should effectively, if I can use colloquial language, be let off the hook in this instance. In my opinion, their decision was absolutely wrong, not just in relation to this issue of pensions, but fundamentally flawed in its purported principle. And one of the things about the law is that one has to sometimes state a principle over and over and over, until eventually the judges make the right decision. because they've come to the conclusion that they thought of it all themselves. They will come to the conclusion on that issue, may not directly assist the women who've been so unfairly treated in relation to this pensions issue, but they will come to the conclusion eventually. Ms Mccurley is a human rights lawyer from Newcastle University. She is a specialist and an expert in CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and she is a shadow report writer in that regard. She too was an effective and articulate witness to the CEDAW People's Tribunal, held, as I said, in London on the 21st, 22nd and 23rd of June last year. Julie O'Shea is a wonderful, I have to say, support in so many respects at the University of Buckingham. She is a lawyer and she works at the University of Buckingham in the most effective way, ensuring that the students at the University of Buckingham in law have mentorship, that they know what opportunities they will have when they go out into the world of paid work. And she I'm the director of the Citizens Advice Law School clinic, where we ensure that the students have an opportunity to interview real live people so that they gain these interview skills. And Julie O'Shea is brilliant as an administrator in that regard, and so many others. Afifa Mohammed, Afifa will correct me in my pronunciation, and I regret that. I'm usually very good at pronunciations. She's a graduate from the University of Buckingham with first-class honours in law. She comes from Mauritius, where she will be joining us today. From Mauritius, she will be joining us on the wonderful facility teams. She is an amazing performer in so many ways, in mooting, in her scholarly work, and she will go forward to work in the field, to practice as a barrister, and it's clear, do well. Jackie Davis is not with us today, but I will read her statement when we come to Jackie Davis, because her daughter is caught up in the floods in Lismore and the issue of climate change, about which her speech relates, is so impacting upon her that she felt that she could not deliver the speech and be here today. But I'd just like to read a short excerpt at this time to introduce her. It was Christmas 2004, and as my younger daughter announced her engagement, a tsunami struck in the Indian Ocean. A close friend of mine was caught up in it, and it was days before we knew she was safe. She had been waist deep in water, clinging to a tree for hours. What she could not talk about was the terrible witness she was to women scrabbling to hold on to children and finding they could save one child only, having to watch the other disappear from view. All over that part of the world, women were having to make that choice: who to save, whom to let go, what to risk. Climate change is presenting the same dilemma everywhere. The most vulnerable women cannot feed their children, give them clean water, migrate with them, snatch them up when bushfires or floods bear down. Research shows that the children who have healthy grandmothers, as well as mothers, have the best chance of survival. Grandmothers, not fathers. And in richer countries, women are choosing not to have children at all. I have no answers. I just raise it as an unthought known, Jackie Davis. And she said at the end of this email to me, if you think there is mileage in elaborating that as something I could make tie in with the issues before the Women's Parliament, I'm happy to talk it over. So relevant and so important. And the issue about climate change is that we can see it happening everywhere, and unfortunately those purveyors of damage to the earth continue to do so through their fossil fuels. And I conclude this by saying I'll go quickly now to the motion before us, and I know that I am having the privilege of far more than the 5 minutes that have been allocated to each member, but we will be able to hear from each member in future parliaments that we will hold here in Cambridge, in this council chamber. This Women's Parliament held in Cambridge, England on International Women's Day, Tuesday the 8th of March 2022, 1. Recognises that the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, outlaws both direct, that is unequal treatment, discrimination, and indirect, which is purportedly equal treatment, discrimination, between women and men in all aspects of life: education, training, employment, facilities, goods, services, accommodation, membership and activities of clubs, administration of laws and programs, and the media. 2. Notes that CEDAW was signed by the United Kingdom in 1981, ratified in 1986, and the optional protocol agreed to by the United Kingdom in 2004. The ratification committing the government and this country to advance, protect, promote and fulfil the human rights of women under all circumstances, the United Kingdom thereby giving an undertaking to incorporate the principles and provisions of CEDAW fully and effectively into domestic law. 3. Observes that despite this commitment and undertaking, legislative recognition by domestication is not yet realised, and there remains no full and effective legislative provision nor substantive equality in practice between women and men in the United Kingdom today. 4. Notes that continued discrimination against women and girls has been worsened by the disastrous austerity measures, particularly impacting working class women and women with a disability, black and minoritised women, older and younger women, so that few, if any, women have not been differentially impacted by these measures. 5. Recognises that A, the Equal Pay Act of 1970, its provisions purportedly incorporated into the Equality Act of 2010, has not brought about equal pay, whether for equal work, work of equal value, or pay equity, or comparable worth, and that any partial implementation secured or advances made have occurred mainly through the courage of women workers and supporters and the organisation of trade unions in the workplace. B, the Equality Act 2010, although a step forward, is more than several steps too few, and its gaps and deficiencies, particularly but not only, as regards obligations of government administrations in public sector equality duty, including gender budgeting, requiring legislative intervention to ensure that women and girls' rights are fully secured in all CEDAW rights and state obligations by comprehensive legislative enactment through a Women's Bill of Rights. C, women's health rights are not properly and effectively recognised, so that the Abortion Act of 1967 requires repeal to bring England and Wales into conformity with Northern Ireland, where women's health rights are protected, consistent with women's right to privacy in consultation with her medical practitioner. D, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, Sexual Offences Act 2003 and associated legal measures, albeit in some respects increasing legislative recognition of the gendered nature of violence against women and girls, are insufficient and in some respects deficient, so that women and girls' rights to just and effective laws governing 1, vilification and misogyny, rape and other sexual offences, criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence, marital murder and dishonour crimes, and the killing of women of a spouse or partner or former spouse or partner. 2, online violence, exploitation, victimisation and abuse, stalking and all social media abuses, including vilification and misogyny. 3, sexual harassment, sexist harassment and bullying in all areas of life require proper and effective legislative action with funding and resourcing of women's services, including services for Black and minoritised women, trafficked and prostituted women, asylum-seeking and refugee women, women with a disability and all disadvantaged groups of women at levels proper and appropriate for care, support, protection and advancement to independence of women as necessary, and never at levels below those services which serve the general community, which is in particular men's services. E, family law, including marital assets and property ownership and distribution, children and associated matters, are unsatisfactorily covered by law. The interpretation or application of law to the detriment of women and polygamous marriage, forced and underage marriage, which require effective attention, including training of the judiciary, magistrate and practitioners. F, access to law and equal treatment under the law are denied or problematic for women and girls, particularly in respect of legal aid and representation in the justice system as a whole, including women in prison and the criminal justice system. 6, we are apprehensive that the United Kingdom's approach and commitment to the climate and biodiversity emergencies are inadequate and in particular do not appreciate the importance of ensuring that the differential impact on women and girls of climate change must be factored into policies and practices at all levels of government activity and action, and insofar as it is possible, into private sector activity. 7 is concerned that knowledge of CEDAW and its provisions, including the CEDAW Committee General Recommendations, GRs, A, by the judiciary, magistracy and practitioners is seriously lacking, and a concerted and ongoing education and training program is necessary to ensure that all who operate in the justice system are aware of the existence of CEDAW, its provisions, and with the passage of the women's rights bills, it is necessarily to be incorporated into this education and training program, meaning it's going to be compulsory for them to undertake this training. And also by members of Parliament, elected members of devolved authorities and local government, and all officers and workers within the legislature and national devolved authority and local government is seriously lacking, and a concerted and ongoing education and training program is necessary to ensure that all are aware of the existence of CEDAW and its provisions, and with the passage of the Women's Bill of Rights, this is necessarily to be incorporated into an education and training program. 8 is concerned that all matters brought to attention by the CEDAW People's Tribunal 21 to 23 June 2021 and incorporated into the President's report be addressed by the United Kingdom Government, and insofar as the devolved authorities of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have the power to do so, they also address all these matters. 9 recognises that while progress can be made through legislation, the trade union movement needs to bring its organised strength to bear on the government and employers to see that CEDAW is implemented. Therefore, the Women's Parliament calls on 1, the United Kingdom Parliament and devolved assemblies of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, insofar as the devolved assemblies are able to do so, 1, to transpose the provisions of CEDAW, including the general recommendations, into domestic law as a Women's Bill of Rights, incorporating the provisions of the Equality Act 2010 insofar as they relate to women and girls. 2, to implement the recommendations of the CEDAW President's Report. 3, to ensure effective and sustained monitoring of the implementation of the Women's Bill of Rights and other measures adopted as set out in the President's Report. And 2, the trade union movement to support the campaign for a Women's Bill of Rights and implementation of the recommendations of the CEDAW President's Report. And now, everybody has maintained silence for so long, for which I appreciate. I give my appreciation. So we now come to the exciting part of the program, When Women Speak. And I call upon Eleanor Redshaw to support the motion before the Women's Parliament. Eleanor.
Debate today. I am named after my grandmother, Eleanor Beatrice Higginson. I listened to her stories, and this is the flag that she used in marches in the suffragette colours of purple, white and green, 115 years old. In 1981, in the East End of London, into a very poor family. Nellie was very concerned about the lack of women's rights, especially for working class girls in the Lancashire cotton mills. She was also aggrieved by the 1832 Reform Act, when some women actually lost the vote that they had previously enjoyed. Two young children, when she was cajoled into joining the Women's Social and Political Union. And later, she became secretary to the new Preston branch. And famous suffragette asked Grandma if she was prepared to make the sacrifice of going to prison for Votes for Women campaign. One of 8 active suffragettes in Preston. She demonstrated in her hometown and probably painted the statue of Lord Derby with tar. In 1913, Grandma gate-crashed a meeting in the public hall where Winston Churchill was due to speak. Once the assembly had started, she stood up and shouted, "Votes for women!" Though the stewards tried to evict her. Eleanor took the seat, and the officials had to find a spanner, and unceremoniously, she and the chair were hurled out into the street. Grandma was arrested for throwing a brick through a window of the Red Lion pub in Whitehall, London, which is the nearest inn to the Houses of Parliament and much frequented by politicians. Nellie got 4 months in jail. May 21st, 1914, Eleanor joined Emmeline Pankhurst and 200 other women in a procession down Constitution Hill to present another huge petition to King George V at Buckingham Palace. They were mounted policemen and the white chap. The women were beaten black and blue, as you can see in this famous photograph. Is it possible? Street court the next day, the suffragettes would not cooperate. Grandma was given a £5 fine or 1 month in jail. But the women never paid the fine. They wanted to make a protest about women's rights. in London, she was held as a second-class criminal prisoner and decided to do hunger and thirst strike. After 8 days, Eleanor suffered forcible feeding, i.e. gruel poured into her stomach using a metal funnel while she was tied down to a chair. Then, Mouse Act. I have her discharge papers, which allowed her to go home for 2 weeks to recover as a mouse. The government, i.e. the cat, sent 2 policemen to Preston to rearrest her, returning her to Holloway. The broke out on August the 4th, and Eleanor never went back to fulfil her sentence. The Representation of the People Act 1918 gave some women their vote. They had to be over 30 and property owners. It took them years of campaigning to achieve that. By 1920, after all her militant suffragette activities, Eleanor became a respected member of the community. She was elected a town councillor, sitting on many committees. In 1945, Eleanor became a Justice of the Peace. In conclusion, my grandmother, Eleanor Higginson, went through hell, along with 1,300 suffragettes who were arrested and many jailed. Emily sacrificed her life in order to promote votes for women on an equal basis with men. That was over 100 years ago, and we have a long way to proceed, so I support the motion.
Thank you, Eleanor Redshaw, indeed, and thank your grandmother.
So one I clearly recall was to get the House authorities to give up some space for a creche where MPs could leave their children and see their children during the day. It was thought to be essential to encourage more women of childbearing age to enter Parliament and to have that facility. So the argument was that there was insufficient space in the House of Commons, although magically there was space for a shooting gallery where the men could go and do their shooting practice. Under Claire Short's leadership, we marched into the shooting gallery en masse to assess its suitability for conversion to a creche. I have to say it wasn't terribly convenient, but it made a point. And I'm afraid it did take several more years before a creche was provided, but it was important to make that statement. So we campaigned on national issues too, of course. Following Labour's victory in 1997 election, women Labour MPs increased to just over 100. I can't tell you what difference that made. It was just fantastic being able to go into cafes and restaurants in the House of Commons and see women there, and also, of course, in the chamber. Mm-hmm. I worked with a number of outside groups, including Women in Science, to increase the number of women in senior positions, to equalise pay and to increase opportunities. I worked with Harriet Harman to improve the support available to women in work. This involved the New Deal for lone parents, childcare tax credits, and working family tax credits. I had a lot of women who came to my surgeries who I think had never been to an MP surgery before. And quite a lot of lone women who told me how difficult it was for them to work when they had children, because the childcare was, first of all, in effect, it just wasn't available. And secondly, if they did manage to find childcare, it was so expensive, they couldn't afford it. And so what I did was to start a social enterprise called Opportunity Links, which for the first time provided social information such as childcare on the internet. It was supported by Cambridge City Council and Peterborough City Council, and also by local businesses. Because they were having trouble too. A lot of local businesses advertising jobs and then finding that nobody qualified was applying for them. because of course there were lots of qualified women who were at home looking after children because they couldn't afford the childcare. So it seemed to me an obvious thing that we had to overcome. So my parliamentary colleagues agreed as well, and when Margaret Hodge became Children's Minister in 2009, she helped us franchise it out to the majority of local authorities in England and Scotland. And at its high point, it was receiving 3 million hits a month, so we knew it was well used. So I stress all this just to emphasize what one can do as an elected representative, working together with your sisters and like-minded men in Parliament and in local authorities. I think it is really important to raise women's representation because women are then in a unique position to improve equality. And one statistic may actually surprise you, that despite all the progress we've made over the years, there are only 559 women in the UK who have ever been MPs. Ever. About the number of men who've been MPs, I won't begin to estimate that. So I may not be using up all my 5 minutes, Chair, but I wish you all the best in all your campaigning efforts, and I'm totally there behind you and fighting for you as well. I support the motion.
Thank you, Anne Campbell, one of 559 women in the United Kingdom ever to be a Member of Parliament. Thank you. And now to Baljit Banger. Please, Baljit.
Thank you. Thank you to the Women's Parliament, firstly, for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to discuss the situation of funding and resourcing for women's services. And my focus is going to be on specialist by and for women's organizations. I'll refer to these as by and for, and when I talk about by and for, I am talking about Black and minoritized women's organizations. I'm not going to dwell too much on the data with regards to funding and resourcing, but I will give you some data just to set the context of what I'm talking about. There is 39% underfunding in the Black and minoritized women and girls sector, and the emergency COVID funding doesn't really plug this gap. 75% of Black and minoritized women in need of refuge spaces in the by and for specialist services were unable to be accommodated during the COVID pandemic. The full-time staffing equivalency in by and for sector is 40% less than in generic organizations. There is a 163% difference in funding between the specialist by and for sector organizations and generic organizations. The funding crisis can be described as follows. Decommissioning of specialist by and for services, chronic underfunding, unequal partnerships where generic organizations receive up to 70% of the overall funding, economic insecurities experienced by Black and minoritized women, which is a ripple effect of underfunding, the practice of institutional exclusion, which operates through the hostile environment, invasion by housing associations into the by and for specialist sector, Black and minoritized women's organizations being 6 times or more less likely to obtain funding compared to generic organizations because of the exclusion criteria that applies in funding applications. So I want to move on to the structural issues because these affect all women, but some women are affected disproportionately. Often, these funding regimes perpetuate existing inequalities. In the current context, we are looking at the impact of multiple pandemics: COVID-19, violence against women and girls, structural inequalities, and racism. Where these inequalities are not addressed, the risk is dismantling of rights-based mechanisms that we rely upon to protect the rights and services of Black and minoritized women and girls. In other words, the current funding crisis in the Black and minoritized women and girls sector does not result from the organizations themselves not having the capacity to fundraise, or the ability to compete in competitive funding, or the ability to present good quality bids. Evidence suggests that most applications by and for organizations actually pass the assessment stage of the funding processes. And that it is at the decision-making stage, when that application arrives at the board or the executive level, that the application is rejected. Evidence also shows that it is at the board and executive level where decision makers do not reflect, look like, or share the lived experiences and the material realities of the women covered by the funding applications. So these boards have no criteria to assess the applications. This leads to the decision of rejecting applications. One final piece of evidence: applications that are made by generic white-led organizations proposing to support Black and minoritized women have a greater degree of success than applications that come from the by and for specialist sector. It is about the way funding regimes are created and operate on the basis of wider inequalities that exist, so that these funding regimes mirror these inequalities and gatekeep how resources are allocated, and also make decisions about which communities benefit and which communities do not. I'm going to leave you just with 3 key points. First, the way systems are developed are simply not inclusive of the equal participation of women. They are built around the experiences of white, able-bodied men. They are not designed to meet the needs of women, and specifically Black and minoritized women and girls. We are currently squeezing ourselves into these systems that are not designed for us, and we are rejected by these systems. We are changing our services to meet funder needs from the effective trauma-informed, women-led, rights-based intersectional provision in favor of a generic model, but what about the needs of Black and minoritized women and girls? Number 2, violence prevention is absent from funding systems. Funding systems do not link violence prevention to resourcing because of the lack of recognition of the holistic service model. Number 3, there is an absence of intersectionality. We have a misrepresentation of the term intersectionality to mean individualized need, when actually it is about addressing oppression and structural inequalities. So funding systems are designed around addressing and responding to individual need. They are not designed around structural oppression. So we need a Bill of Rights to address structural funding inequalities and to stop the decommissioning of specialist by and for services. In closing, I would just like to say that wartime racism must be denounced at all times. I stand with African, Indian, and women of the global South trying to flee the war in the Ukraine. They have equal human rights, just as all women have human rights. I support the motion.
Thank you, Baljeet. Thank you, Baljeet Banga. Thank you. We now go to our 5th speaker, and I'd like to intercede by saying that Coretta Scott King once said that the battle for women's rights is never won, and we have to refight it every generation. Now, Saoirse Khan is one of the younger women in our parliament today, and what we represent in the parliament today is this diversity that is necessary to ensure that the struggle does continue every generation. Saoirse Khan, thank you.
Hi there, I'm Saoirse, and I would say that I'm a kind person. I say that in the same way that you might say that you're ambitious or goal-oriented. And I'm not saying I'm not those things, but I'm also kind, and that's something I'm quite proud of. But what I think is interesting about our society is that as a woman, being kind isn't something that's necessarily praised. Expected, definitely, but not often praised. I think that generally for women, being kind is associated with being weak. But in my opinion, finding empathy for people is something that you have to be strong to do. I have a lot of aspirations, but one of the main things I aspire towards is a society in which being a good woman doesn't necessarily mean trying to be everything that we would traditionally associate as masculine, largely being more selfish. This is for a number of reasons, an important one being that through enforcing the idea that the only way to be a feminist is to succeed in a system designed to oppress us, we tacitly enforce and uphold that very system. We should be challenging every aspect of the patriarchal society we live in, and if we aim simply to inhabit a space in it, we just shift our own position without bringing about wide-reaching change. We also have to recognize the limitations of this kind of feminism to truly help the majority of women, who remain underrepresented and disenfranchised by a capitalist system. Through moulding feminist aims to free market capitalism, we allow women who this system inherently discriminates against to be sacrificed. It is of course upsetting that just under 14% of executive directors in the UK are women. But changing this won't necessarily change the systemic factors that mean that single women are the group in the UK at the highest risk of living in poverty, and that this risk only increases for women of colour. It's about looking further than ourselves, about trying to do the most for the most. I think that a lot of the traits which we as a society value put being individualistic and driven above all else, and thus make society a more hostile place. Moreover, in turn, traits which would arguably make society a more generous place are seen as weak or compromising. Being generous, empathetic, or crying easily are all seen as signs of weakness. This is largely because of their association with womanhood, which, in a patriarchal society, is inherently seen as being a flaw, but also due to the fact that our society prioritizes the individual above all else. Thus, traits which look outward are seen as counterproductive in achieving what we might consider to be success. I think we have to evaluate what we value. It's not that caring about your career or being ambitious are bad in any sense. I definitely have both those characteristics, and that's also something I'm proud of. But I also think we would all benefit if we aspired to be proud of being kind, of being empathetic and generous. That if, as a society, we decided to look out for each other at the same time as focusing on what we wanted. I'm not trying to set up an either-or situation here, but I think we live in an individualistic world, and that through changing our perceptions of what traits we value, and through considering why we value some traits above others, we can create an environment in which more people are able to thrive. Through this, we allow everyone, no matter how they identify, more space to establish who they really are. My mum once told me that to her, feminism was just letting women be whatever they wanted. I think ultimately that's my aspiration. That as a society, we stop encouraging women to fit any molds at all. Recently, I think the mold has been the girl boss CEO who is willing to trample over everyone and anyone to get what she wants. In my opinion, rather than a step forward for the feminist cause, this is in many ways a step sideways. We are still telling women what they should be. Ideally, we would live in a society in which women can be whatever and whomever they like. I also think it's about creating a society in which this is really an option, which accommodates for all the aspects of life which we need it to, rather than forcing us to choose. Where we understand that aiming to be kind is just as impressive and valid as aiming to be successful. Women's Bill of Rights will not fundamentally shift the characteristics that society values, nor will it necessarily topple the patriarchy. But I do think it will give women security. And without a secure foundation, it's hard to expend energy on figuring out what you want and who you are. It will open doors that should be open, and allow women to choose if they want to go through them. Through protecting our rights, it will allow us to focus on the changes we want to see, that we want to make. I aspire to see women be able to be whoever they like, however they like. That's what I want for myself and for everyone else. And I think this can be a step in that direction, so I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Saoirse Khan. And now to Deborah Brazil.
Schools are quietly going about reproducing patriarchy. They do this more or less unnoticed, unchallenged, and are pretty much unaccountable now. Did you know that 75% of secondary schools are now academies under no central oversight, and there is no education ombudsman as a fail-safe? If you wanted to take a complaint about sexism in schools to the next level, you'd have to find a legal angle. And that means being willing and able to take a school to court. And which parent is going to do that? But finding a legal angle wouldn't be easy anyway, not because schools aren't routinely discriminating against women and girls. They sure are. But because the very law that we would look to for our protection, the Equality Act 2010, actually allows discrimination. We know that women and girls are invisible throughout most schools' curriculum content, and yet most people don't know this. The Equality Act 2010 deliberately and explicitly excludes the curriculum content within the legislation. This means that as long as schools teach the same discriminatory curriculum content equally to boys and girls, then they're acting within the law. Their rationale is that excluding the content of the curriculum ensures that schools are free to include a full range of issues in their syllabus and to expose pupils to thoughts and ideas of all kinds, however challenging or controversial, without fear of legal challenge based on a protected characteristic. characteristic. An example they give is that it would prevent a boy from claiming sex discrimination when he's required to do a module on feminist thought. But since most schools rarely teach about women or girls or about feminist thought, schools themselves ensure that boys will never need to complain about that. Schools do not expose pupils to thoughts and ideas of all kinds, only in the main to white men's thoughts and ideas. The thoughts of the female half of the population are invisible, absent, apparently irrelevant. Our End Sexism in Schools campaign has just this week published crowd research on the bias in the whole novels and plays read in English lessons in the first 3 years of the secondary school curriculum. You might know it as Key Stage 3. It's important to note that all schools, academy and maintained, have unfettered choice in these 3 years. Our research shows that 76% of the novels read are authored by men. But even worse, 82% of novels feature male lead protagonists. So the female authors chosen by teachers don't in fact guarantee female lead actors. And even worse, 99% of all plays studied are authored by men. 99%. Women's exclusion is near complete. When you look at it by schools, the picture is just as shocking, however you cut the data. 44%, that's nearly half of all schools, read no novels in those 3 years by a female author, none. And a further 33% of schools read only one. So that means, adding that together, that 70% of schools read one or no novels authored by a woman in Key Stage 3. In fact, it's a minority of schools that read the novels by women that are read. 16% of schools read half of all of those female-authored books. All lawful. The very Equality Act exclusion that claims to protect women from boys refusing to learn about women and girls is the very same exclusion that allows schools to discriminate and not teach about women and girls at all. It's all lawful, all lawfully. The current state in schools results in the invisibility of women in the everyday taught curriculum, where most time in the school day is spent. Schools persist in teaching about only the male half of the population, and as long as teachers fail to value women's voices and experiences in this way, schools send the message that women are inferior and not worthy or equal to men. Schools are institutionally sexist, and they're part of the system that continuously feeds and reproduces the patriarchal culture we live within, generation after generation. This really matters because there is a direct line from this everyday sexism in schools to the sexual harassment and violence against women and girls in schools, and continuing in our lives after school. Boys learn to be superior, and I quote that recent Ofsted report here, and it is certainly reinforced in schools. Cultural change will only come when the academic curriculum is overhauled to create an equal space every single day for women's achievements, voices and experiences alongside men's. Teaching the non-examined PSHE lessons on consent is not the solution alone. It will only ever be a sideshow. The End Sexism in Schools campaign supports the Women's Bill of Rights, and in support of this motion, we demand that the Equality Act 2010 be amended to make equality within the curriculum content for women and girls the law, and schools should deliver it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah Brazil. And now I call upon Alexandra Billet.
Thank you. I'm really proud to be able to speak about migration and asylum in the debate today, because a Women's Bill of Rights has to include the voices of migrant and refugee women. Think about this, around 2 in 10 people in the UK are born outside the UK. Today we're speaking from Cambridge, where almost 4 in 10 people you see on the street or on a bus are born outside the UK. I am one of the thousands of EU migrants that call Cambridge their home. When I moved to the UK, I was 18 years old and I wasn't engaged in politics at all. And I couldn't imagine that I would spend 5 years of my life now campaigning every single day on migrants' rights. Last year, I became the first Romanian-born county councillor that I know of, at least for England. And no one will be surprised about being elected as a 26-year-old woman of a migrant background in local government is not very common and is definitely not very easy. A year before this, before 2021, I ended my long-term relationship with the UK Home Office by becoming a British citizen. And I haven't stopped campaigning on migrants' rights since, although I am now proudly a British Romanian citizen. I am really sad to see every single day in my work migrants and refugees being treated as an afterthought in many policy discussions. We are rushing to tick the lived experience box in consultations and often forgetting about what genuine and long-term engagement with migrant and refugee communities look like. When we speak about, whether we speak about the environment or democracy, the economy, or locally about housing or schools, we must consider the voices of migrant and refugee women and not deliberately avoid the topic of migration on the doorstep or in our conversations. We have allowed a select group of politicians to transform migrants into commodities, to think about migrants in terms of their tax contributions and P60s, and not to think about migrants as members of our communities, which we are. We also have allowed immigration and asylum policy to be decided by cherry-picked focus groups, politics, rather than thinking about the evidence and having empathy in this policy. We are now witnessing a system which treats migrants badly in the UK and also treats migrant women even worse in so many cases. We hear from the government that the migration system, the new immigration system, is firm but fair. But the UK immigration policy now is not fair. And actually, the Nationality and Borders Bill in Parliament, the Elections Bill, the Police and Crime Bill will make the situation even worse for women and migrants in general. It is not right for the state to be able to remove someone's citizenship without notice. It's not right for the state to refuse to respect the 1951 Refugee Convention. Just look at the UK's record now. Just a few days ago, 150 Ukrainians turned away from Calais. We have a system restricted to family members, unlike many other countries, including neighboring countries that allow visa-free access now in a moment of crisis. But let's think about the positives today. Let's think about what a fair immigration system would actually look like for women and for us. A fair immigration system for me is when women do not struggle to prove their existence in the UK, when the settled status automatic checks don't find their continuous tax records because they couldn't be in work for a period of 5 years. A fair immigration system is when women don't struggle to bring their family to the UK because they don't satisfy a minimum income requirement. A fair immigration system is when we do not have women, we don't have the situation where women have to choose between feeding themselves and feeding their children because their visa states you don't have recourse to public funds. A fair immigration system is when women can be in control of their immigration status. A fair immigration system is when migrant and refugee women actually have a say in decisions affecting them directly. And I will give one example here. In 2020, Scotland and Wales passed legislation giving all migrants and people living in Scotland and Wales the right to vote in their elections. And yes, this includes people with refugee status. And we need to have the same here in England as well as in Northern Ireland. Some may look at this proposal and think, that's not possible, it's a long way to go and to campaign, but probably that's what we have thought when the campaigners that we heard earlier campaigned for the right of women to vote. People need rights, but also they need representation to actually be able to stand up effectively for those rights. Women's rights are migrants' rights and refugee rights too, so let's stand up for them together as women and most of all as people who care. I support this motion and thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra Bullet. And now for Susan Buckingham. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. I start with the premise that it's a patriarchal society which prioritises the domination of nature, including humans, for the benefit of a small minority of the population. Such an approach, call it industrial masculinity, hypermasculinity, or as I've recently read, petromasculinity, has led us to the current climate emergency. Eliminating discrimination against women within this structure is impossible. The system needs transformation. Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Commission on Climate, chaired by a woman, Dame Julia King, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, reported in 2021 that the region's greenhouse gas emissions are 25% higher than the UK average. And at this rate of consumption, we'll have used our emissions budget to 2050 within the next 8 years. It also refers to the risks facing the region. We are the driest and hottest region in the UK, the lowest, and therefore particularly vulnerable to inundation from sea level rise. With sea level rises predicted between 2.4 and 4.7 metres by 2100, depending on whether we meet our international obligations, the fens are likely to be lost somewhere between 2150 and 2200. Development runoff and the kind of concentrated rainfall increasingly seen in Europe will lead to regular flood events, and well before then. The intensity of speculative development, with more than 45,000 new residential properties planned in Greater Cambridge, many of them truly unaffordable for the women who really need them, and the moving of one of the few well-functioning sewage works to Greenbelt land and other large-scale, high-carbon-emitting projects will speed us along this path even faster. But what the Commission's report fails to acknowledge, however, is the gendered implications of this. There's not one single mention of women or gender, nor of ethnic minority people or elders. And all of these demographic groups are especially vulnerable to climate change. As Jackie Davis has already spoken through Jocelyn, women are known to be disproportionately affected by climate-related disasters. This is true of floods, and particularly for women from some ethnic minorities. Maureen Fordham's UK research shows how coping with flooding takes a particular toll on women who are more likely to have to provide the necessary housekeeping adjustments and collective care. Worldwide, women are much more likely to die in floods than men. Increasing food prices as the fens become flooded, salinated, or just plain built on, and increasing energy prices, as we are seeing now, are also disproportionately borne by women. More than women are counted in groups defined as being in poverty, such as single-person households, elderly and living alone, and lone parents. This is likely to be a reason why women are more likely to die in extreme heat as well. All the disaster literature tells us that women, especially poor, black, and brown women, experience disasters in particularly gendered ways, including rises in domestic and sexual violence. This has been made clear by Margaret Alston's work on bushfires in Australia. Where women do dominate is in grounded local environmental action, such as those opposing the mega incinerators in the north of our county, and women who have led the fight against fracking in Preston, the fracking nanas. But dominant power structures generally mean that their voices are drowned out by the big financial interests such as fossil fuel companies, hedge funds, and developers. Strategies to avert a climate catastrophe, both physical infrastructure, such as better and cheaper public transport using existing routes, and social, such as shorter working weeks and flexible working, will also benefit women. In fact, many of the strategies we're hearing about today to eliminate discrimination against women will reduce environmental problems as well. The recently published 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability of climate change has as its focus transformation. It calls for system change, which is a really radical call by the IPCC, and this includes societal change. For society to have a chance to avert the climate and other environmental emergencies in a just and humane way, this societal transformation has to eliminate the current toxic masculinity and develop a society in which everyone is valued equally. I therefore support the motion.
Thank you, Susan Buckingham. Thank you. And now a call on Glenys Williams.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Bit disturbing. I want to make some points which really back up what Deborah's been saying, Deborah Brazil. I support this motion. I'm a physicist, and my subject has enabled me to travel the world teaching and recently settle in Cambridge, and I've had a nice life. I've never really had to worry about money. And I put that down to my subject. If you look at the top 10 highest paid jobs in the UK, as taken from the website yesterday. They are the following: 1, enterprise architect; 2, risk manager; 3, enterprise account manager; 4, technical program manager; 5, investment banking associate, and so on and so on and so on. Virtually all of the highest paid jobs in this country involve some sort of numeracy related to problem solving, some sort of ability to manage data, and some sort of ability to look at complex problems and systems. These are skills that are taught in school, starting with physics. Of men and women who graduated with physics degrees in 2021. This is from the IOP, Institute of Physics website. The proportion of female full-time first-year students studying physics undergraduate degrees in the UK is only 21%, and there has been no significant increase in this figure for years. That's 21% of the physics students in the UK. It's about the same for engineering, and it's probably less for computer science. So that's 1 in 5 physics students, and physics students are kind of rare. Engineering students definitely are rare, are women. Recruiters to the sorts of jobs or career tracks that get you access to those highly paid jobs that I mentioned, and also access to power within our society, are looking at a pool which is restricted to women, has a restricted number of women in it. And that is one of the fundamental causes of inequality in our society. Subject uptake at schools. Over 10 subjects most commonly taken by men and women at A level. Girls: psychology, biology, mathematics, sociology, chemistry, art and design subjects, English literature, history, geography and business studies. Boys: mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, economics, business studies, history, psychology, geography and computer science. Noticeably present and high on the boys' list, but absent from the girls' list, is physics. Slightly different at GCSE, with science a compulsory subject in the UK, which compulsion was introduced in part to tackle the problem of girls eschewing physics at degree level and technology-related careers. So we've got a compulsory situation there. Boys perform marginally better than girls in physics at GCSE, but the gap is small. 2019, the last year that we had proper exams, there was 41.8% of girls awarded A7 or above, and 45.7% of boys awarded A7 or above. It's about 10% difference. Percentage is about 10%. But it's certainly in the same ballpark. If you look at examination results from the girls who are forced to take physics at GCSE, 16-year-old girls are certainly as good at boys as taking physics. However, despite performing nearly as well as boys in physics at the age of 16, a far, far smaller number of girls go on to choose physics as one of their A-level subjects. Of the boys getting an A7 or above in GCSE physics, 39% went on to study physics at A-level. Of the girls getting A7 or above, 13% go on to study it at A-level. This is where the disparity really lies. Girls who are very, very good at physics will sometimes choose it for further study. Girls who are only average at physics will very rarely choose it for further study. This is not the case for boys. A significant number of coeducational state schools in the UK have no girls at all studying physics at A-level. I'm going to give you a couple more lists just before I finish. These relate to the percentages of men in the subjects. I'd like you to think about the pay that each list gets. Vehicle technicians, mechanics and electricians are 99.2% men. Carpenters and joiners, electricians and electrical fitters, plumbers and heating and ventilation engineers, and similar are all over 95% men. At the other end of the scale, the careers that are majority percentage women, the most women, the careers which have a high percentage of women are nursery nurses and teaching assistants. Then you get medical secretaries, legal secretaries, general secretaries, and something else which I can't remember, my notes have dropped, to do with nursing. Those have more than 95% of women as the people that make up the group of people doing it. Compare the pay of those two groups and then wonder whether we're doing our girls any favours letting them think that physics is not for them. I commend this motion.
Thank you, Glenys Williams. And now to Clara Giroux. Clara.
Thank you. So I will be speaking about employment. And so traditional gender norms have continuously impacted women's ability to grow within the employment sector. It is true that there has been a change in the representation of how women work and what they're doing now in the employment and labor market. However, we are still witnessing how these repercussions are affecting women and continue to affect them to this day. So, quoting Dr. Sivsons in an article produced by the Women's Budget Group, she stated that inequality begins prior to a woman entering the labor market, and that special attention should be given to how girls are educated and what work they are formally and informally encouraged to enter. Additionally, there was a briefing paper produced by the House of Commons in March 2021 called Women in Economy, which stated that 78% of the workforce in health and social care were women, and that as well, 71% of the health and social care workforce were also women in education. This is a clear evidence of how traditional gender norms are still impacting women, because women are told to believe that their best skills belongs in their nurturing or caring or their ability to care for people, compared to men who are continuously encouraged to enter more competitive, higher paying salaries. These sectors are also salaries which are notoriously known for being underfunded and undervalued. Additionally, in recent affairs such as COVID, women have seen a lot more unemployment, redundancies, and a lot of more women applying for benefits. Women have also been the highest percentage applying for the job retention scheme that came out of COVID due to issues of women belonging in sectors which are likely to have been closed down by the pandemic. Subsequently, the gender pay gap is also an issue that continuously impacts women's ability to be equal with men, obviously in the employment sector. For there to have been an effective change, we need to reassess the wage levels of these traditional gender roles in these work sectors that women are constantly being told they best fit in, such as childcare, nursing, education, and health and social care sectors. We also must start at the stage of looking at jobs which were not valued beforehand. And we must reevaluate and reassess and review how well and how actually valued these positions are for our society. We must implement new work skill assessments to ensure that the gender bias that was in previous ones is no longer there for us to actually have an effective change. The Office for National Statistics, stating statistics for 2021, has said that the gender pay gap is also a lot higher for all employees compared to just part-time employees. That has become because women make up majority of part-time employment due to their caring responsibilities and child care responsibilities that they have outside of work. Additionally, women in April 2021, it was found that women within the age group of 40 to 49 were being paid 12.3% less than their male counterpart. That is almost 1 percentage higher than before the pandemic. Finally, we also have women who are in the age gap of 39, after 39, are a lot less likely to make it into managerial, higher paying positions. This is a group of women who is likely to be mothers juggling work, childcare, and potentially caring for their elderly parents as well. We also see that having children affects women's careers progression a lot more than men's. In a joint UK survey produced by the Women's Budget Group, it found that 66% of women who had become pregnant at full-time employment had reduced their hours once becoming a parent compared to 26% of men. Subsequently, women also suffer a lot of inequalities when it comes to their pension age and their pension gap. It was found that on average, women contribute a lot more to their pension pots than men, 9.4% compared to 8.3%. It is found also in a prospect, in an article produced by Prospect, that women, that there was a gap of 37.9% in the pension in the ages in the year of 2019 to 2020. That is almost twice the level of the age gap that same year, which was, of the gender gap that same year, which was 15.5%. The pension pay gap is incredibly detrimental to women as it affects women when there's little they can do about it. There's also definitely not a lot of attention by the government to address it, and there's no policies, if any, to really change anything. So we must stop allowing these gender norms and these traditional gender norms to affect women's ability to grow and to have economic independence. Thank you, and I support this motion.
Thank you, Clara Giroux. And now to Julie O'Shea. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Dr. Scott, and thank you to the Chamber for inviting me today. I am a woman in law, qualifying as a solicitor in the 1990s. I worked in regional law firms before going on to forge a career in higher education as the clinical legal education manager at the University of Buckingham. I would like to tell you about my experience as a woman in legal practice and education, the barriers I see through my work in promoting opportunities, and how the profession is seeking to address this. After finishing university, it was daunting to approach law firms for a training contract in a very much male-dominated sector. Like many students who I now support, I was very conscious of being the first generation of my family to go to university, really knowing that my profile did not fit that of the traditional applicants seeking a career in law. I came across a number of challenges, probably very familiar to many women here today, and so often as is the case at interview stage, which ultimately led to rejection. Resilience is the key in any profession, particularly for women seeking to enter the law. That said, I found myself pleasantly surprised when eventually I did come across a regional law firm offering the opportunity to allow me to qualify by taking my training contract in 2 stages, 1 year in litigation with time out to do the vocational training course, and then to return in my final year to cover non-contentious work. This approach was really forward thinking at that time, and it really offered me much required flexibility. It is now, I'm pleased to say, called the SQE, the Solicitor Qualification Examination, and this is a new solicitor qualifying pathway open to all aspiring solicitors in England and Wales. The advent of the SQE offers graduates, particularly women, the flexibility to create a pathway to qualification which best suits their personal circumstances, with the options to front load assessments or to separate exams with work experience as I did. And this new outlook will particularly appeal to women starting out in the law and to ensure that they go on to develop their careers to maximise their full potential. I went on to work in insolvency litigation, which was not without its challenges, covering complex injunction cases in male-dominated business sectors. I'm pleased to say my career progression eventually became increasingly positive, and I was appointed an associate, given co-responsibility for a large debt recovery unit, taking the lead in the litigation team. I also took tenure of a networking organisation in its early days, Women in Enterprise, and I was very proud of that. I'm sure that this is very much attributed to those female professionals at that time who sought equality in the legal workplace. So whilst the future of women entering the law is very positive, with so many opportunities developing through the introduction of the SQE and changing attitudes towards diversity and inclusivity, more really needs to be done to allow access to placements, particularly since the lack of face-to-face shadowing opportunities during the pandemic. Progress is happening, but it's slow. According to Chambers Partners 2021, statistics show an improving trend of female trainees growing by 5% over 6 years. At first glance, these figures indicate a sign of success for women, as men represent less than half the successful candidates. However, through this period, law graduates have been around 63% female, and so proportionately the profession is improving, but it still has a lot of work to do. So what can be done to help improve progression for women entering the legal profession? Access to more placements, role models and mentoring schemes to guide young women, particularly those from first-generation families who face significant cultural and educational barriers, and start early. Last year, I was given the opportunity to help support A-level students interested in a career in law at the Sir William Ramsay School, a project which we have supported with other schools in the region. I'm proud to have grown the Street Legal Placement Scheme at the university, promoting shadowing opportunities with law firms, the judiciary and barristers, through links with female lawyers like Hannah Price from Hales Percival and HR professionals Samantha Hope from Shoesmiths. Taking the lead to create mentoring projects with female lawyers like Andra Stanton from EMW Law and Emily Izzo, one of the Buckingham part-time law alumni. In workshops, I've worked with barristers, Fabiola, who's here today, to promote direction for women entering the junior bar, and Nasreen Shah, a founder of Her Bar, a new career platform dedicated to aspiring female barristers. My hope, by supporting more projects like this, the growing trend to break down these barriers will continue, promoting equality in the legal profession for women and for generations to come. And in order to achieve these changes, I second the motion for this Women's Bill of Rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie O'Shea. Thank you. And now to Jenny Stofa. Jenny.
9 months ago, I gave birth to my first child. It did not go smoothly. My experiences in pregnancy and postnatal care have left me with both deep physical and emotional scars. But I was lucky. My experiences, however traumatic, also left me with a beautiful boy. But other women are not as lucky as I was. In recent years, the news has regularly featured reports of the inadequacies of maternity care in the UK. The NHS has been criticised for persistent shortcomings. In September 2021, the Care Quality Commission published a damning report warning that mothers and baby are at risk of injury and death, and many incidents remain unreported. 41% of maternity units were rated as either requiring improvement or inadequate. Across the UK, we're clearly continuing to fail mothers and mothers-to-be. Issues have undoubtedly been exacerbated by COVID. Many birth parents and partners were unable to be at the birth or had very limited time. I myself sat in A&E alone and scared, fearing a miscarriage because my partner was not allowed to attend with me. Of course, these things pale in comparison to not being able to say goodbye to dying loved ones, but it makes them no less traumatic for those that experience them. But it is under such extraordinary circumstances that protections for women enshrined in law become even more important. CEDAW is clear. Maternity services are a fundamental right. Article 12 states that parties shall ensure to women appropriate services and doing so for free where necessary. But what exactly should these free and appropriate services look like? What is clear is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There are, however, some worrying trends that need addressing. Despite my experience, I was statistically at an advantage because I am white. Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women, and Asian women twice as likely, according to a 2021 report from Embrace. Another report from The Lancet found that Black and Asian women are twice as likely to experience stillbirth, premature birth, or low birth rate. During COVID, 55% of pregnant women admitted to hospital with COVID-19 were from a BAME background, despite making up just a quarter of the births in England and Wales. In response to this, the NHS increased support for these at-risk women. They've also committed to ensuring that 3/4 of pregnant BAME women will receive care from the same midwife during and after they give birth by 2024. This is a good first step and something I would like to see rolled out to all pregnant women. It was thanks to seeing a midwife I had visited before that I was admitted to hospital. Because she had met me before, she could see that something was wrong. It's more important than ever to know and trust your midwife. Another disproportionately affected group are immigrants and refugees. We are all acutely aware of the current situation in Ukraine, with horrendous stories of women giving birth while bums fall and others fleeing to the border with their newborns. It's right that these stories make headlines. But what might not make the news is the ongoing struggle that migrant and women and refugee women face. Women who are not ordinarily resident in the UK, with certain exceptions, are charged for hospital treatment at 150% of the tariff. Maternity Action, which has campaigned on this issue for some time, puts the average charge for maternity care at more than £7,000. If these debts are not paid, the NHS must report it to the Home Office. I can tell you, babies are expensive enough. I can't imagine arriving as a refugee, pregnant and with few possessions, and being handed a huge healthcare bill. In doing so, we run the risk of women not accessing services at all for fear of those charges, putting both their health and that of their unborn child at risk. Enshrining CEDAW into law isn't a magic bullet. Women's services need sufficient funding and resourcing. This includes specific services for Black and minoritised women. But CEDAW can provide important protections by 1, requiring free services for everyone who needs them. 2, ensuring those services are supplied in an appropriate way in regards to treatment, the way they are provided, and how services are tailored for groups like the BAME community. And 3, by providing a better framework and also a route to accountability for inadequate services. These benefits and many, many more enshrining CEDAW would bring for both pregnant and postnatal women is why I support the motion, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jenny Stofa. And I now call on Louise Matthews. Louise Matthews.
First, they came for the 50s women, all 3.8 million of us. The Tories' 1995 State Pension Act, Peter Lilly hid it, so no impact assessment, no notification of any changes. We were only women. 1997, the Labour government did nothing to look at it. 11, the Tory coalition government added another 18 months to the 50s women's state pension age. More horror for us. The 19 ONS stats show that 204,000 50s women have passed pensionless. That's a shocking statistic. Chapter 60 secured a judicial review for a review of the 50s women's pension situation. The outcome of that review, the frightening statement, women had no right to fairness. How does that come about? 50s women losses in terms of 6 years state pension age increases. Causes losses with bus passes, heating allowance, and their lives. And the exacerbated now by the loss of the triple lock or suspension of the triple lock. Presumably that could happen again, but it's that cumulative loss all the time. Who've now secured their pension, state pension, there is still the issue of the women who are coming behind because of the way the age processes work. So they are now facing the same hardship and difficulties as we all are. We're looking at the EDM that's currently around 906, which needs MPs to sign up and become proactive in rectifying this issue. That's on the cards. Back to 60 have evolved into CEDAW in law and also the CEDAW People's Tribunal, which was an amazing thing to happen. Sorry, I'm just going to sit down. And we need them to be involved and taking this forward. MPs, unions, local councillors all need to be involved. CEDAW is an intersectional framework which needs to be in law for the protection of girls and women wherever they are, wherever they come from, whatever their situation in life is. I've got a note also to Sharon Graham, who's the General Secretary of Unite. We need your campaigning clout and your visibility to really look at the pension issue and support 50s women and all the women coming behind. Because if this is got away with, then it will happen again. The issue as well of the triple lock, that's a huge, huge thing to be happening. And if we don't get somebody to look at it properly, it will just keep happening. Just also to say that I picked up on Clara's issue about pay gaps, and pay gaps lead to gender pension gap. And the gender pension gap is now 40%. That's in the last 12 months or so. I fully commend this motion to this Parliament and I endorse it.
Good. Thanks so much, Louise. And of course, that's the culmination of the discrimination against women from birth, really, that we've just had from Jenny Stofa, the issue of women and birth. We've had from others the issue of economics and the pay gap at the lower age. And as you point out, Louise, there's a cumulative effect, and women live longer, and women therefore suffer longer from the discrimination that begins, as I said, from the beginning of women's lives. Thank you, Louise. May I now call on Annie Galpin? Thank you, Annie Galpin.
Thank you. Louise, I can tell you that Sharon Graham and all women trade unions will be debating pensions as well as CEDAW and other things at Women's TUC tomorrow through to Friday. So rest assured we are on the case as well. Today I'm speaking as a disabled woman. CEDAW 2019 made recommendations to the UK government specifically on disabled women as a disadvantaged and oppressed intersectional minority. Our needs are also addressed in the 50 articles of the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons. Together, these treaties frame our fundamental rights to protection from inequalities that disproportionately affect us both as women and as disabled people. We must take an intersectional approach to tackling inequality and discrimination because we all have multiple aspects to our identities and experience combinations of challenges that impact on our ability to access and exercise our human rights. Those of us who are most in need of human rights legislation are those of us who are disproportionately marginalised and less likely to have our voices heard, and as such, find it much harder to participate in society. We may all be born equal in the eyes of the law, but that doesn't translate to our lived experience. Some of the barriers facing disabled women in the UK today: poverty, inaccessible accommodation and services, lower employment rates, greater pay gaps and health inequalities. We have already borne the brunt of 11 years of austerity measures and the crisis in social care, and now since 2020 we have been overlooked and discriminated against within the responses to the pandemic. 6 in 10 of all COVID deaths have been disabled people. If you were a disabled woman, you were 11.3 times more likely to die from COVID than a non-disabled woman. This was not due to inevitable health issues. It arose from inequality and poverty, from lack of access to services, and through institutionalized sexism and ableism. Conditions that affect women can be disabling due to the symptoms and the impact being minimized and dismissed by the medical profession. For women to simply not be believed when they seek support. Endometriosis, menopause, pelvic floor dysfunction, PCOS, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, mental distress, and a whole raft of energy-limiting chronic illness and autoimmune disorders which disproportionately affect women, such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. As girls and women, we are less likely to receive timely diagnosis of autism and ADHD, resulting in long delays and trauma which drastically reduces our quality of life and overall health and well-being outcomes. And Claire mentioned that earlier. Disabled women are less likely to be believed when reporting ill health. We are less likely to receive accessible and tailored information on issues such as menstruation and contraception. We are less likely to be afforded informed consent for treatment options and social care. Period poverty should not exist, but it does, and is one of many penalties that women experience simply for being women. There is a whole new cohort of women disabled through COVID, and an urgent need for long COVID to be recognised as a disability automatically in the law. And also, women are disabled through climate change and forced migration, through conflict and war and insecurity. It is well established that disabled women are more likely to experience domestic abuse and find it much harder to seek support or access services to escape. Our agency as disabled women is not well understood by service providers, empowering our abusers to gain and maintain control. Also, TUC research this July 2021 found that 7 in 10 disabled women have been sexually harassed at work. In our younger disabled women age group of 18 to 34, this rises to 4 out of 5. Disabled women are less likely to have a paid job, and when we do, it is more likely to be part-time, freelance, or insecure. We experience a substantial pay gap, 9% less than non-disabled women, and 36% less than non-disabled men. Despite legislation on discrimination and equal pay, women do not have equality, and those inequalities are further compounded for disabled women. Representation and visibility matter. Just as gender equality is a collective issue, disability equality is too. Sisters, we must leave no women behind. Please support this motion.
Thank you, Annie Goldman, thank you. And to Debbie Allen, thanks Debbie Allen.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I support this motion. Over the last 13 months, I have lost about about 13 or more people, including my daughter, auntie, cousins, so people very, very close to me. Gave me a few months out of action, and I believe I met this wonderful lady when I was trying to recover from racism in the workplace. And the reason I'm here today is because I support this motion, and I'm so glad that it includes Black people, Black women. I was at a point where I actually couldn't talk, and I wrote through poetry, so I'd like to read that to you. But if you want to know about social inequality, go on YouTube, watch the $1 million race. I'm hoping that somebody will do something about why we haven't received the Ford report from Labour, because I don't know how we're going to address inequalities if those that hold the power do not take race and equality and racial disparities seriously. There's also disparities in the Met, where they're wanting to recruit more people like me. But I've experienced domestic violence, and I'm reluctant to use people who don't look like me to help me when I've grown up and experienced certain things. Now, there's a lot of negativity, and I want to be positive. So I've been very active in my community. I've started a toddler reading group, campaigns to save our local library, and now I give my time looking after toddlers. I've also instigated a food bank where we deliver to people in the community, and that's been an eye-opener as well about the real poverty that's going on that's not reported. And I also have a Keep in Touch with Your Elders group. So slowly I'm rehabilitating myself spiritually because, as Annie said, the services are not catered for people like me who, after you have an experience or a number of mosquito bites of racism, you're left with PTSD, anxiety, depression, fear of leaving your home. So in a nutshell, I'll read, please take the knee. I couldn't speak, so this is how. And, you know, don't forget about George Floyd, as Charlene White from Loose Women said. In everything that's going on, there still seems to be time for racism. And I support this motion because I know it will go through. So, set your timers. We're going to kneel for Floyd. The crowd at the rally graciously stooped. Who could be annoyed? How about you, officers? Aren't you joining in? Yeah, they had to. It would be a sin. Passers-by quickly knew what we were doing. All around the world, take the knee ensuing. After about 3 minutes, a cramp set in my right butt. Elders started twisting, but they kept their mouths shut. My knee started tingling, body weight set nerves off. I tried to mask the discomfort with a little twist cough. For elders, those with health issues and sciatica, this discomfort could not matter. One took out a kerchief and mopped her brow. Can the youth of today take this baton on now? Our elders came through insults, being spat at and beatings, the type of racism that was not fleeting. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish, go back home. Not many shared this pain, they journeyed alone. And so in the fact that there was no sharing, how have we prepared the next generation in caring? After 6 minutes, I turned to my mentor and gave a perturbed glance. My God, I gasped. He didn't stand a chance. If we can't kneel without stretching and twisting, how did that officer manage to leave his knee in? It's murder, I said. Who can disagree? Lock that racist up and throw away the key. Across the waters and here in the UK, brutality, racism happens every day. Black lives matter every day. And I pray that this movement is more than a distraction. People, thank you all for getting involved. We need to take action. Every bullying, harassment, sexual incident, any microaggressions, report it all, talk your truth, heal from their transgressions. How will anyone know if we don't talk? How can there be healing, learning, understanding if you don't talk your walk, your journeys, triumphs and pain? Receive your accolades and bear your shame. But it's not shameful to hurt. You are human, and this alien behavior must be drawn in the dirt. Initiate processes so it's all logged and counted. Despicable behavior can never be discounted. Your silence conceals what's really going on. For you to be honest can never be wrong. Upskirting, Me Too, glass ceiling, nepotism. Talk about it all. If you don't talk now, how will they fall? We smokescreen, we hide, we pretend all is well, but our minds matter, our stories we must tell. This one is called Unfinished because the soil is still turning. This one is called Unfinished because my heart is still burning. I don't know how to put into words all I've been through, but I hope you're inspired to tell your story and to press on too. And as Annie said, sorry to keep referring to you, when I went through the tribunal process, there was nobody that looked like me. So to explain to a panel that I found music that I listened to being called monkey music, or having to report somebody calling a service user black poo-poo as a term of affection, or, they, the judges, perceived it as banter, but it damages people. And when I am out of the workplace, I'm not putting into my pension. So, everything ties in: mental health, trauma, not being able to work and contribute to society. So I thank you for involving me in this project, and I definitely support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie Allen. And now to Claire Reeve. Claire.
The National Autistic Society estimates that 1 in every 100 people has autism. The male to female ratio is 3.1 at latest estimation. The National Autistic Society is 60 years old this year, so why are women and girls still struggling to be seen? Women and girls can often struggle to get a referral for assessment, and if they are successful, they find there are long waiting lists. Getting a diagnosis can be difficult, partly because the assessment criteria has historically been biased towards the male presentation of the condition. They tend to display more externalizing behaviours. However, some have been making an interesting point about gender stereotypes, including Dr. Kate Fox, an autistic poet and comedian, who said, "I don't think there's an inherent difference between autistic men and women. What there is a difference in is how society treats and socialises males and females." More awareness of autism and ADHD has resulted in increasing numbers of women self-diagnosing in adulthood. There are more neurodiverse women and girls than people realise, but they may either not realise it themselves, do not wish to be diagnosed, or often stuck in the system. Many are misdiagnosed altogether. In 2017, at the age of 8, my daughter Poppy was diagnosed with autism after a lengthy battle with her school to refer her for assessment after a few years of her behaviour being different inside and outside of school. The female Senko and her male class teacher refused, so I ended up writing an 8,000-word report on women and girls with autism and how Poppy's cognitive and sensory traits matched a lot of the criteria. They looked at this report and also knew about many of my daughter's traits in school. They also knew she was having meltdowns outside of school, but said that as she wasn't aggressive and was doing okay academically, they didn't think she was autistic or wanted to label her. This is a common ableist attitude about autism. Eventually, we persuaded our GP to refer her. All in all, it had taken years to get an autistic diagnosis, but once my daughter had one, she began to understand herself and her autistic brain better. And today, aged 13, she strives to be her best authentic self, though life can be challenging. Many parents and carers don't know what autism, ADHD, or both in girls looks like, and some are not confident in dealing with frontline professionals. Girls can end up so traumatised they refuse to go to school, college at all, and they can be excluded, and some are left with no educational setting. A Senko in a different local authority school told me that she got her ADHD diagnosis in her 50s by having to go privately. She said, as an experienced Senko not knowing enough about ADHD in females herself, it's unsurprising that many frontline educators are not well informed, let alone trained. The National Autistic Society also recognises that autism traits in girls are underreported by teachers. Professor Amanda Kirkby says that neurodiverse females may have left school with few qualifications despite having skills, failed to fit in socially and or failed to find a job. Others may have succeeded because of resilience, but often at some cost. I've met many women who feel simultaneously relieved and angry at gaining a diagnosis in adulthood. Some are frustrated at not having achieved their potential. Sadly, many end up underemployed or unemployed. Others end up in a justice system having been misunderstood. This isn't to put down the phenomenal work of teachers. It is to highlight that parents and teachers need better support to identify and understand autism in girls. Carol A. Adam, Professor of Accounting at Durham University and late diagnosed autistic woman, has also made an important point. We should consider autistic strengths and not focus solely on deficits and impairments. Sometimes autism isn't considered because of the presence of strengths. I recently spoke with Fiona Fisher-Bullivant, an advanced specialist nurse practitioner in autism and ADHD, 30 years experience in clinical practice and an author of books on autism and eating disorders, and she said, often women are given a plethora of medication and offered various interventions which are not always evidence-based for women with autism, as there are limited studies. Education, training and bespoke services are lacking. Young women are having to fit into boxes, and when the interventions don't work, they're referred to as too complex, and so no interventions are offered, and they're passed from clinician to clinician and service to service, or they are described as not engaging. Sometimes neurodiverse teenage girls and women self-medicate, and this can lead to addictions. This can be devastating for work, relationships, home and health. Some feel like inadequate parents. Some can sadly self-harm, and some even attempt or commit suicide. Spectrum News reports that autistic women are twice as likely to commit suicide than autistic men. Findings published in June 2019 in Psychological Medicine by Tatcha Hervikovsky, lead researcher of the study and associate professor of clinical psychology at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, said people on the spectrum, and girls and women in particular, are at high risk of suicide, according to the largest study yet to analyse suicidal behaviours in autistic people. The numbers go up for women who have autism and ADHD together. Some autistic women and girls develop serious eating disorders, and it also must be stated that not picking up on social situations quickly enough can put women and girls at greater risk of traumatic experiences such as abuse. There are intersectional issues to also consider, including gender identity and race, and the National Autistic Society also states that there is some evidence to show a link between gender dysphoria and autism, and that autistic people may be more likely than other people to have gender dysphoria. I'll finish by saying that there needs to be more funding to train frontline professionals, including a wider base of creative and experienced clinicians, as quite often only a few key people and services are ever consulted, and it's always the same ones. More experienced individuals can help to influence policy, something women and girls with autism and ADHD desperately need. Thank you. I support the motion.
Thank you, Claire J. Reeve. Thank you. And now it's over to Afifa Salam Mohammed in Mauritius. Afifa, thank you.
Women have always been marginalised across all areas, including their health. Speakers before me, such as Miss Jenny Stofa, Annie Galpin, Claire Reeve, have touched upon these issues that I'm going to speak about, but I'm going to go into more deeper context on it. I will start with a renowned case, the 2015 Montgomery case, in which Miss Montgomery, a diabetic woman, gave birth to her first child, who was born with shoulder dystocia and cerebral palsy. Babies delivered vaginally by diabetic women are more at risk of being born with shoulder dystocia, and possibly cerebral palsy, which is why cesarean section is always considered. In Miss Montgomery's case, she was not given all relevant information before she could give an informed consent. Thus, the ruling on the Montgomery case gave a new perspective on informed consent, whereby women now must be included in decision-making regarding any treatment. However, that was the case concerning maternity care. There is no informed consent across other medical concerns for women whenever the condition can be diagnosed. In July 2020, Baroness Campbell produced a report which stated that medical professionals do not listen to female patients when they're describing the symptoms and injuries suffered, and subsequently failed to obtain an informed consent from them for treatment. I have personally heard testimonies from friends and families who went for checkups regarding some health concerns, but were not heard by the medical professional, and their symptoms were dismissed or misdiagnosed as being symptoms of stress or premenstrual symptoms, only to be diagnosed years later for serious diseases. A medical professional told me that my symptoms that I was experiencing was not known to them, and it could possibly be a symptom of stress. One of the main reasons why women's symptoms are dismissed or misdiagnosed is because of a lack of research done on how women's bodies work and respond to treatment. And some go so far as going the extra mile to ban women from clinical trials, resulting in women being told they're simply stressed. Remedies being available in medical law is not enough. With discrimination against women on all areas of life still rampant, seeking legal help using a Women's Bill of Rights will help ensure that women's rights are respected across different areas, including in women's health. A Women's Bill of Rights would help avoid exclusion of women from clinical trials. Therefore, I support the motion being put forward.
Thank you, Afifa Salama Hamid. And now it's to Ella Betts. Thank you, Ella Betts. Oh, sorry.
When I first became homeless, I didn't realise that that's what I was. I was 22 and going from my sister's sofa to my niece's bed. I was grieving the death of my mother and my family home. I had no money, no home, and no idea what I was going to do next. But the word homeless never crossed my mind. Fast forward 5 years and I'm fleeing a relationship with a man who controlled every waking moment of my life. He ripped me away from my family, friends, and my career. He made it so that I was reliant on him financially, emotionally, and every way possible. He stalked me physically and on every social media platform and made me feel unsafe in every space that I could try and find for myself. I called the police and begged for help to be taken somewhere that he wouldn't find me. It took 3 more visits for them to accept that this was more than a case of an overbearing partner. I stayed with friends and family to hide from my abuser. I slept on sofas, shared beds, and had all of my belongings in one bag. Still, the word homeless didn't enter my mind until I spoke to a housing officer at Cambridge City Council. Not pregnant, no children, not mentally ill enough. Those were the reasons that I was given for not being helped, despite the fact that I told them everything that had got me to that point. It was as if she was reading it off a checklist, as if my rights to safety, warmth, and basic human decency relied solely on my ability to be a mother or prove that I was more mentally vulnerable than the next person to seek their help. I left in tears after being told that returning to Cambridge was like returning to the scene of the crime in regards to me fleeing domestic violence. With the help of Inner Comfort, I got a bed in a local shelter within a few days. My experience in a mixed shelter is one that I will never forget. As a vulnerable woman who at the time was scared to be around any person, not just men, I found myself retreating further into my shell to avoid any confrontation. This only made me more of a target. During the 4 months I spent there as only one of a few women, I was victim to verbal and physical intimidation, sexism, stealing, extortion, and threats. What I witnessed myself and heard from others shook me. Men who would recruit women to offer other sheltered or street homeless women the opportunity to live with them in exchange for sex. A man punching a woman for allegedly stealing his bike, and the woman getting no support from the shelter staff because it happened outside of the building. That same woman being so upset at the lack of support she received that she left in the middle of the night and subsequently lost her bed. The only thing the staff would say when questioned why they didn't encourage her to stay was that she was a grown woman. I'd been thrown into a world where violence against women was the norm, and people didn't bat an eyelid at others carrying knives for protection. I had to adapt quickly to my environment to fit in with other residents who accused me of being an undercover police officer. I walked a thin line between fitting in enough and being deemed appropriately proactive so as to be the next person in line to move on. There were days when I would be called into the office by a male worker who tried to convince me that a mixed move-on house was a quicker option for me than the women's only house I was waiting for a room in, regardless of the former being closer to where my abuser lived. This happened more frequently when I began to gain self-confidence back and would often be pulled aside and spoke to for causing issues. These issues were me pointing out the time that a male worker laughed at the sexist comments being made towards me by residents, the same male worker who belittled my mental health and told me that he doesn't have depression in his house. My story is just one example of why a women's only provision in Cambridge is necessary. The system cannot fail who it was not built for in the first place. Women are consistently forgotten about within the talks of homelessness because councils are so focused on statistics as if we aren't anything more. We cannot be counted in your statistics when we are being pulled from the street to sell our bodies for sex in exchange for somewhere to rest our heads. We cannot be counted in your statistics when we choose to stay with a man who beats and rapes us because we have been conditioned to think that we will lose our children if we leave. And we cannot be counted because we are hidden from you and everyone else for our own safety. We are hidden from police who promise to help and then fail to convict the man who makes you scared to leave your home. Because yes, even when you eventually get a home, you're terrified of being in it. We are hidden from the mental health services who pass you from buck to buck without any regard for the fact that you are not reliving your trauma every time you retell your story. We are hidden from the general consensus that homelessness is a choice and that it ends with a roof above your head. We need a Women's Bill of Rights, and I support this motion.
Thank you, Ella Betts. Thank you. And now to Chloe Gallandez. Thank you, Chloe.
On this day, I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak to you all. I'd like to quickly commend Ella for her bravery and a wonderful, impactful speech. Learning and knowledge is highly prized in all societies. There's always been a strong tradition of respect for education. The advantage of widespread education is the cultivation of international skills and attitudes which contribute to our values. This intermingling of cultures and social differences impacts the very core of our society. It creates a greater sense of human dignity and freedom. To loosely quote Brigham Young, if you educate a man, you educate a man. If you educate a woman, you educate a generation. But what does education really mean for women? It means a life of less limitation. It means safety and security. It means an opportunity for self-sufficiency. It means an escape from inadequacy and inferiority. Women deserve an education to not only aid them in the acquisition of valuable skills and knowledge, but to help them to develop an unwavering strength in their values: integrity, justice, honesty, resilience. Women have always been subject to the very class expectations that insisted our existence was rudimentary. Women were not encouraged to have academic aspirations in fear that it taught them to undermine their attachment to the household, that academic study would distract women from their human nature of becoming mothers and wives. And while mothers and wives are the spark in our children and husbands, they still deserve a choice. The empowerment of women is a global endeavor, and it begins with education. Movements such as the women's liberation movement have helped transform education and the places of women in academia. The fighting force behind the advocacy for women's rights in education has pushed us to persevere in the face of adversity, equipped us with the fearlessness to challenge our traditional and progressive roles, and has given us a choice in the trajectory of our lives. We are all extremely fortunate to hail from a country that does encourage women to pursue education, but many others are still lacking in this, and so we cannot become complacent. We cannot take our women in education for granted. Our rights should be enshrined in our legal system. My ambition is to become a solicitor. As a young Filipino woman, I imagine that journey to be no easier feat. But as my graduation date nears and brings me ever so closer to achieving that dream, I take a moment to maintain my gratitude. I am grateful for my education. I am grateful as an immigrant daughter to immigrant parents who worked tirelessly to provide me that education. I am grateful that poverty never succeeded in preventing my mother from finishing her education. And because of that, she has now been serving this country's NHS as a nurse for the past 20 years. I'm grateful that the women in my family stand as incredible role models and mentors in the pursuit of education. We were once, and in some aspects, still barred from succeeding in certain roles in society due to the dominance of men. Discrimination and inequality fester at the root level where there is a lack of education. But a gender equitable and encouraging system empowers both young girls and boys in the development of their communication, their appreciation, their respect, and honor for each other. Women possess the potential to transform communities, strengthen economies, and contribute to the stability and welfare of our societies. I believe that women and men will always be complementary, and society flourishes best, not when we perpetuate constant negatives about the other, but when we prosper together. And with that, I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe Gallandez. Thank you. And now to Fabiola Arucci. Fabiola.
The UN Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women was born out of a desire to protect all women, wherever they might be. However, it is apparent that some of the most vulnerable women, those with no state, no country, and now no home, have been left far, far behind. As a lawyer, a former refugee, and a woman, these things for me are inexorably linked. Where the state has failed to treat refugee women in a way that affords each and every one of them the human rights that they're entitled to, we will hold it accountable in law. We need look only at the barbaric and unjust treatment of women held at centres for detention, such as the one at Derwentside, where women are denied a basic right, such as that of adequate legal advice. I could give you an endless stream of statistics and numbers about what these women face on the way here. But the question is, what do these women face once they're here? And for that, I want you to stop just for a second so that I can put you in their shoes. Just imagine you fled your home as a victim of gender-based violence, sexual violence, torture, and a victim of war. Imagine being in a foreign land where you don't recognize anything you see and you don't understand a word that is spoken. And then imagine being taken from your family and put in a detention center, in a cell for months, as if you are the criminal and not those who are waging the war. On a telephone, alone. And the pain that comes with it, to share what has happened to you. To pour out your life story to a stranger, and then the telephone just disconnects. It disconnects because there's poor signal. And now, the details of the abuse you've endured, repetitively, again and again, because you fear that if they don't know what's happened to you, your application will be refused. This is what refugee women are facing once they get here. It's estimated that 70% of those killed in today's conflicts are civilians. Many are women and children, who are especially vulnerable when law and order breaks down. I had the honor of meeting one of such refugees last week. She is a Supreme Court judge of the court in Afghanistan. She fled Afghanistan as a result of being on a kill list of the Taliban. She was on that list purely because she was in law and she was a woman. The week before they took over, 2 of her colleagues were killed. They were assassinated on the way to work. One shot through the head and the other shot through the heart. Only because they were women. Arriving are teachers, doctors, engineers, architects. For the work that they have done until the moment that they arrived here. Instead of retraining women and giving them value, we have become a place that is deprofessionalizing them and de-skilling them. Something that we are all familiar with, but must work to change. A couple of years ago, we celebrated in the law profession 100 years from the Sex and Disqualification Removal Act 1919. 100 years of women in law, slowly but gradually, chipping away and shaping a tool to support our communities, and in particular other women. But we must open our eyes as a society now to the problems facing refugee women. Those from Palestine, from Syria, from Afghanistan, and now we see from Ukraine. Unless they're addressed. Where such about humanity or access to the rights that they deserve, we vouch that we will be here for them. And by we, I mean women, all of us, like the women in this chamber here today, who have worked tirelessly in the face of perpetual and unrelating discrimination, and whether a refugee or not. We are a network, a sisterhood. As women, we must support each other. We must fight for the rights of each other, legal or otherwise, and especially those enshrined in laws like the Convention and this Bill of Rights. And when our sisters cannot speak for themselves, we must and we will be their voice. I support this motion.
Thank you, Fabiola Arucci. Thank you. Now I hand over to Natalie Turney. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. On January 19th this year, Dr. Helen Mott's vehicle had broken down and, stranded and alone at night, she called the AA to seek rescue. On the phone, she was informed that as a lone and vulnerable woman, she was not a priority. That's equality, she was told, and she took to Twitter to contact the AA further. In response to this information, the AA stated, "You've been advised correctly. We don't prioritise based on gender. We do consider the location. So as an example, we would prioritise someone on a motorway over someone in a supermarket car park. And so it appears that the measure of priority is a risk to safety in the circumstances. With companies commonly adopting a shareholder as opposed to stakeholder-focused approach to corporate governance, women are disadvantaged. On the basis of a historical and inherent masculine dominance, typification of the role and skill sets attributed to it, representation of women on the board remains too low. Enlightened shareholder value as a principle can be utilised in embracing the inclusion of women and fostering a more diverse and relational approach on the board. Indeed, the Companies Act 2006, upon introduction, sought to address this. Directors must have regard to enlightened shareholder value and must consider the impact of company operations on stakeholders as part of their fiduciary duties. The issue remains that this duty under Section 172 to promote the success of the company, having regard to a range of factors set out therein, is subjective and thus difficult to enforce. Furthermore, it's for the company to enforce the duties and not outsiders. Though an aim of the Company Law Review Steering Group was to increase focus on directors' duties and good corporate social responsibility, accountability for a lack of consideration of the corporate impact on women, both intra and extra-corporately, is thus problematic, and the ultimate impact on female consumers of a lack of representation can be significant and life-threatening. Representation on the board and at policy-making level is fundamental in ensuring good corporate social responsibility and the protection of women. At policy-making level, women must be represented to ensure adequate consideration of the female impact of corporate activities, and sufficient training must be delivered company-wide to ensure that those representing the company in society uphold this social responsibility. At 6 years old, on a Saturday at midday, I was followed from a busy shop into the car park by 3 men as I made my way to catch my lift. At 17 years old, I had just passed my driving test and driven to work, and as I went to leave the car park, a man tried to gain access to my vehicle. In June 2017, 23-year-old Molly Mclaren walked to her car in the car park of her gym when at 11 a.m. in broad daylight, she was stabbed 75 times to death by her ex-boyfriend. The earlier example given by the AA responder in their order of priority, influenced by a complete misconception of equality, makes no account for the risk to safety women face in everyday life. The AA followed up by an apology and an assurance that women, lone women, are prioritised as part of a vulnerable group. But this Twitter event demonstrates a complete lack of understanding of the constant state of vulnerability every woman lives in. This complete lack of understanding of an employee translates into actions and responses that place women directly in harm's way. And women must be inherent in decision-making, policy-making, and training development to ensure that what it is to live as a woman is heard and reflected in business activity. According to the government-appointed Hampton-Alexander Review of early 2021, the number of female executives on the UK's top-listed companies increased by 50% in the preceding 5-year period. So progress is underway, but the review sets out that more must be done. Women are underrepresented in business and as consumers, and it cannot continue to be the case that women lack representation at decision and policy-making level. Women must break through the glass ceiling, and companies and company directors have a responsibility to act accordingly. I support the motion.
Thank you. Thanks, Natalie Turney. And now to Shabina Begum. Shabina Begum.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And can I just also take a moment to acknowledge everyone in here who's actually just shared a part of them to give a message, and some of the personal stories that were shared Thank you so much for doing that. And especially on a day like today, I feel so full to be surrounded by so many inspiring women. So thank you for asking me to be a part of this. I'm going to be speaking about child marriage. So essentially, child and forced marriage, sorry. And essentially my professional experiences in those areas. Now, when we think about forced marriage is recognised as a human rights violation more or less globally. And in the UK, we have a very clear message because we have legislation that has criminalised forced marriage in 2014. But 7 years preceding this, we had forced marriage legislation, which was created off the back of the death of a woman. So many of you have probably heard of Banaz Mahmood, and she was killed in the name of honour, or as Dr. Scott would say, as a dishonour, because it's not honourable to kill. And it took a woman's life to be ended for us to recognise in the UK that honour-based violence is a type of crime, and forced marriage falls under that umbrella. Now, that's an adult woman. Now, take that a notch back and think about children that are then forced into marriage. We don't have a clear enough message for children in the UK. And what that means, as the situation stands, the reality is children between the age of 16 and 17 can still get married in the UK with parental consent or judicial consent. The good news is we're working on this child marriage bill, and it has actually passed the third reading. Well, it's passed its third reading, and so hopefully this is to become legislation. But what does that actually mean in the current context and for children while they wait for this to come through? Now, just so we're all on the same page, when we think about forced marriage, the UK definition for forced marriage is a marriage in which one or both spouses do not, or in the case of an adult with a learning or physical disability or mental incapacity, cannot consent to the marriage. And forced marriage invites violence and other forms of coercion, which may include emotional and physical abuse, economic duress, or the threat thereof. Now, that definition does not account for children, so there is a gap in that definition. And I do also want to take a moment to make a distinction between forced marriage and arranged marriages. And the clear distinction is the ability to consent. If it starts off as an arranged marriage and that person can no longer consent or withdraw their consent, it becomes a forced marriage. And that's a very, very important distinction to be made in this kind of work. Now, the reason we really need to be very clear about our stance on child marriage globally is this is an area of law which demonstrates what happens when you don't stand by your global commitments. Now, in 2014, in the UK, we hosted the Girl Summit, and our Prime Minister then made a very, very clear announcement that we're going to do something about child marriage. We're going to work towards the UN agenda to end child marriage and FGM by 2030. What we then did is became a global bad influence, because Bangladesh were also at this conference, who at that time had a very clear age of marriage of, I think it was 18 for women, 21 for men. They then went back to Bangladesh, the Prime Minister, and she created an exception based on the very good example given by the UK. And that was their mechanism of reducing their statistics. So by creating an exception, suddenly the statistics of forced marriage and child marriage were reduced because they had actually reduced the bar for the age of majority. We are actually responsible for that. And we have to be very, very careful on the kinds of messages we give because A, there's that global influence or bad influence element, but B, we globally invest so much money on child marriage programs abroad. So what message are we giving our girls and boys in the UK? You don't matter as much, but we're going to make sure that child marriage around the world is solved. But you can get married at the age of 16 and 17. So we give a lot of mixed messages in the UK. And that's been a part of the problem in some of the work that we've done in this area. Now, I'm not going to throw out lots of statistics, but I do just want to stop for a moment on the 2019 statistics, where they're around, this is pre-pandemic, where they're around just a little less than 1,500 women or girls that came forward to the forced marriage unit to get some support on this issue. Now, it was majority women and girls, And there was a category of people who identified as not heterosexual. They were far more vulnerable to be subjected to forced and child marriage. That, during the pandemic, reduced by 44% in statistics because suddenly young people were scared to come forward because they didn't want to vilify their parents. And when you start to think about actually where have we attached the responsibility on this type of human rights violation in a young person, they're having to stand up against their parents. And how do you do that? And how do you do that, especially if one of your COVID, and now it's only your mum or your dad, and their last wish was for you to get married at the age of 16. And these are the practical issues and the emotional issues that I had to deal with during COVID to try and protect a lot of young people and try and get them the relevant injunctions, but they didn't want them. They're like, we don't want your protection right now. We actually just want to stand by our parents. And the main reason I stand by a motion like this, and I would support the Women's Bill of Rights, is it's the message that we get across to people. And we really have to be united in that, because if a young person knows, and we saw this in the case of FGM, and hopefully we'll see this when the child marriage bill becomes law, if a young person knows that something is illegal, because generally in lots of these cases, the parents are law-abiding citizens, and it might be this one cultural practice or this belief that they have that the child needs to get married, that might be their stumbling block. But once the parent knows that it's illegal, actually even the parents back down. And so for that reason, I support the motion, because once we actually tell women, actually we're dignifying your right to be human as a starting point, and here is the written document to do that, that's when we can actually start properly on the front line. And that's when we can actually start to think about equity and equality in a very different way, in a more achievable way. And for that reason, I support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shabina Begum. And Nora Al-Ani. I call upon Nora Al-Ani.
Thank you. I think this is one of my all-time favourite International Women's Day ever. So thank you so much for inviting me, and it's such a privilege to share this space with all these awesome women. This year marks the 40th anniversary of our Rape Crisis Centre here in Cambridge, and as an organisation, we've been taking that opportunity to reflect on what has changed for women and girls that we work with in that time and what still needs to be done. So after we set up in 1982, it would be another 10 years before rape within marriage became unlawful in this country. And it would be another 21 years before we saw the Sexual Offences Act of 2003 come into force, replacing the Act of 1956 with more specific and explicit definitions of consent and rape, and with the additions of several new offences added to the Act. And it wasn't until the mid-1990s that the first national framework to tackle child sexual abuse was written in the UK. So some things have changed and improved, but it's important to remember that there are some things that have not changed at all. The numbers of those being subjected to sexual violence and abuse has not decreased. The impact and consequences on the lives of those subjected to sexual violence have not diminished or lessened in any way. The survivors that we work alongside have their emotional, mental, and physical health and well-being impacted, their social and economic prosperity limited, and every aspect of their lives affected by these experiences. And this is then compounded by the fact that for too long now, sexist and misogynistic attitudes are accepted as cultural norms in our society, and these attitudes give legitimacy to behaviours that harm women and girls. We know, for example, that sexual harassment and abuse takes place in all areas of our lives, not just late at night or in poorly lit spaces. We experience sexual harassment in broad daylight, on our way to school, on public transport, in our workplaces, or just walking down the street going about our day. And the damage caused by rape culture, victim blaming, and harmful myths and stereotypes cannot be underestimated, because they collectively form the social, political, and institutional norms that at best deny the reality of sexual violence and at worst perpetuate it. They silence, shame, and blame us for being subjected to sexual violence, often denying us access to justice we have every right to, or the support we so very much deserve. And in turn, They excuse and elevate the behaviours of those who perpetrate these offences, allowing them often to carry on with impunity. The fear, risk and experience of sexual harassment and abuse often limits our freedom of movement and diminishes our contribution to the world around us. It should be of such significant concern to us all that half of the population will often shrink our lives in response to the threat of male violence. To expect to be safe in both public and private spaces is not a luxury. We all have a fundamental human right to live, study and work in places free from the fear and experience of sexual violence. So violence against women and girls has got to be elevated and recognised as the serious issue that it is. It has to be made a strategic priority for both local and national government, within our law enforcement agencies and across institutions such as health and education. And one of the key things is having leadership that acknowledges and tackles the institutional and structural problems that are compounding violence against women and girls. Having those in positions of leadership deny that institutional sexism or racism exists in their agencies, having them say it's not as bad as all that, can only slow progress or changes that we are trying to make. So now really is the time to be pushing for change and for sustainably resourced specialist support services, because the true scale of sexual violence by individuals, those in positions of power, trust and authority, by groups and within institutions, is really starting to be revealed. We recognise what a privilege it is to do the work that we do at Rape Crisis. We are inspired every day by the incredible strength, courage and resilience of the women and girls we work alongside. More and more survivors are coming forward to speak out, to be heard, to seek support and redress in whatever way has meaning for them. Reporting of sexual offences has actually increased to its highest levels this year, and yet only 1 in 60 of those that do report are likely to see their cases go forward to prosecution. And of those cases that are prosecuted, less than 2% of perpetrators are being convicted. So we know that our prosecution and conviction rates for rape and sexual violence are at their lowest level since records began a decade ago. And the government's end-to-end rape review that was published last summer fully acknowledged and indeed apologised for the way that sexual violence and abuse survivors were being failed by the criminal justice system. And yet the report seemed to lack ambition or any sense of urgency. So I think we must take this moment and make it count, and insist that the time is now for a Women's Bill of Rights. We owe it to the women who built before us and to leave it as a legacy for the women to come after us. I support this motion.
Thank you, Nora El-Ani. Thank you. Now I call on Bethany Howell.
Sarah Everard, Kirsty Tudor, Wenjing Zhu, Ishrat Ahmed, and Sabina Nessa. Just a couple of the members of the femicide census. Violence against women and girls, or VAW, as adopted by the United Nations 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, is defined as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, and arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. We have seen in recent years an increase in the amount of cases involving sexual violence against women in one form or another. As a survivor, I can't tell you just how much of an adverse effect going through something so deeply personal has on an individual. However, a good friend said to me, or recently, that every 7 years or so, your body changes, so much so that the cells that were once affected by rape, sexual assault, or violence in any form will have disappeared. However, the experience, or in my case, the scars, they're just for life. Rape culture, as it is known, is the trivialization or normalizing of rape and sexual assault. Without tackling false narratives of acceptance, Many women and girls suffer the devastating consequences of violence, such as living with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, becoming suicidal, and I think the worst one, having no support whilst you're going through this. No woman or girl should fall victim to the hands of a man or an individual who does not identify as a woman. Admitting that you have fallen victim to a sexual-based crime is, in some cases, extremely difficult. There are many reasons that prevent the reporting of such crimes, but the main one I have come across, and my reason for non-reporting for 3 years, was the idea of not being believed. The statistics that are thrown around will never really, truly represent the survivors of such crimes. And here are just a few of the statistics I actually picked up from Rape Crisis. So more than 1 in 5 women have experienced rape or sexual assaults as an adult. And that's nearly 5 million women in England and Wales who have experienced at least one of these offences in adulthood alone. 118,000 women experienced rape or sexual assault in the year of 2019 and 2020. More than 70 women in England and Wales experience at least one of these offences every hour. Every hour. Most female victims and survivors, 86%, are raped by someone they know, and nearly half, around 45%, are attacked by a partner or an ex-partner. And one that we heard earlier, less than 1 in 60 victims and survivors of rape who do actually go on to report the crime that has occurred, while the police aren't able to charge them, not a conviction that occurs. So action needs to be taken now. We cannot wait another 30 years for the UK government to finally realise the importance of CEDAW. It's time for them to act, and for them to act now. My name is Bethany Howe. I'm a survivor of sexual-based violence, and I support this motion.
Thank you, Bethany Howe. Thank you. And I must remind everybody that Sarah Everard, a male police officer, falsely arrested, kidnapped, raped, murdered and defiled the dead body of Sarah Everard on the 3rd of March 2021. Sabina Nessa had her life wrongly taken from her by a man on the 3rd of March, on the 17th of September 2021. In between those two, the 3rd of March, Sarah Everard, the 17th of September, Sabina Nessa, 81 men killed 81 women in this country. Who actually knew that statistic? I didn't know it until I worked it out just then. 81 in between those two deaths. And that's why it's so important that Bethany referred to that, because she referred to Sarah Everard and to Sabina Nessa, and that's how we think about them. We don't actually realise that in between, 81 women were killed in this country. I now hand over to Anna Serrano. Thank you, Anna.
Hi, everyone. It has been a pleasure to hear all of you. Thank you for sharing this day. Today, International Women's Day, I received a letter from someone who I know since I have memory, someone who unfortunately we all know. Allow me to read this letter. Dear Anna, I notice you are distancing yourself from me. I took care of you and protected you for so long, all your life. Since you were at school and I advised you not to mix with boys, because that's wrong, you are a good girl. When you were a young woman and I told you not to wear particular clothes, I was protecting you. You were provoking men's nature. I sent your dad to tell you you look like a hooker. He was only trying to protect you as well. He knew it will be your fault if you'll be sexually abused. It's down to you, he said. Later on, I supported you in your silence when one of your parents' friend sexually abused you. In your home, in your parents' home. You were 13, do you remember? I was there with you when he kept coming to visit your parents. I reminded you how many times you've been told not to provoke. So you knew well whose fault it was. Later on, you became stubborn, wanting to study, and this is definitely no priority for women. Who do you think you are? Women are meant to stay at home and take care of men and children. Your parents tried to make you reflect, but you persisted. So they had no choice but to ask you to leave home and pay for your studies yourself. Your obstinacy had consequences. At work, you were finally put in place. Your opinions were ignored. You were not allowed to speak. And you had to take all the tasks that men should not be doing. Women trying to take men's job. What's becoming of society? I hope you learned from this to know your place. And I was glad to hear you found a woman's job at the hospital as a support worker. I thought you were coming back to the path of righteousness when you met your partner. But you challenged him when he told you to respect boundaries. Why is it so difficult for you just to keep quiet, silent, keep the house clean, the food ready for when he arrives? And most importantly, respect him. Your opinion doesn't matter. You should not be saying people that makes him feel bad. Neither should you allow your family to be part of this. You are his support, and your insolence was not giving him a choice but to put you in your place. I tried to help you to keep quiet when he shouted at you, because you just made it worse. I helped you to cover your bruises on your face. After all, you don't want that he pays for your mistakes. Lately, you pushed me away when I came to give you advice. You became bitchy, aggressive, insolent, bossy. You are not agreeable anymore. You don't smile at everyone. You are going to protests and saying that you want the same rights as men. I think you are lost. You are going against the law and against culture. You should see how arrogant you are when you say those things. It seems to me that you only want to hurt men. You say you don't, but your words say otherwise. Soon you will suffer the consequences of these decisions. Only lost woman takes this path. I wish you the best. Signed, your misogyny. That's right. We all have this someone in our lives. We all have been raised in a misogynist culture. These were a recollection of real-life experiences from many women. Women get consequences when trying to protect themselves from the damage caused by misogyny. We lose jobs, we get verbally abused, we get told we are despicable. When we are victims of horrific assaults, we are vilified instead of the perpetrators. I am tired of being called feminazi when asking for respect. I am tired of being told how to dress, how to speak, what I can and what I cannot do. I am tired of being silenced, and I am tired of being invalidated, undermined, ignored, and insulted. And for me, this stops now. I say enough, and this is why I support this motion. So my children don't get advice from misogyny, for my children to be educated with respect for equality and kindness, for my children being raised to appreciate difference while not taking freedom for granted, for my children to learn that oppression is the tool of the weak and the fearful, and most importantly, for them to learn that gender equality means freedom to be whoever you want to be, for someone and not just for a woman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna Serrano. And now we'll go back to Chris Mccurley. Something went wrong in the technology so that she wasn't actually heard on the YouTube. So I introduce again Chris Mccurley. Please, Chris.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much, if any, that you've heard, but I'll try and go through my presentation again. I want to thank the Chair and the Parliament for inviting me to take part in this important event today. And having been given a second opportunity to speak and hear all those women who've gone before me, I really want to say I've been so inspired by those women. And I thank all of you for everything that you do. You're amazing. This is a vitally important event, as our rights are under threat today more than ever in my lifetime, and it's vital that we're all aware of that. To that end, I have to say I've been blagging my way into any platform I can get onto to try and shout about it and raise awareness for over the last 15 years. We are at an incredibly critical point. And I feel angry about what's happening to women in the UK and in fact all over the world. I'm a practicing international human rights lawyer, and I've specialised for the last 30 plus years in working with women and children, mostly from migrant and minority communities, who've experienced all forms of abuse, including FGM trafficking, forced and early marriage, to name but a few. Many of these women and children are, for clear reasons, the most vulnerable in our society, who desperately need to access the law and their rights. For the last 12 years, I have had the privilege of being a CEDAW shadow report writer. And how that works is that every 4 or 5 years, the government has to appear before the CEDAW commissioners, the United Nations in Geneva, and evidence how they are complying with the articles of CEDAW Convention. Before the hearing, the government publish a report in which they invariably say that the United Kingdom government is fully compliant on all articles concerning women's equality. Once we've got that report, then the shadow report team, of which I'm one, then go to work, and we write a report in response, which is to tell it like it is. It's the warts and all report, which then goes to the UN commissioners. After that, we all go to the UN in Geneva, and the commissioners there hear evidence from the government and from women such as myself. And at the end of that evidence period, we get a determination, which is like a judgment, which tells the government what they're doing that's failing to get up to the mark, and what they've got to do now to comply with the CEDAW requirements, and how long they have to do that. I've now had the honour of giving evidence at the 2 most recent inquiries about equality before the law and equality in family life. That's Articles 15 and 16. The 2013 inquiry happened immediately after LASPO, that's the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act, became law. It was a law that decimated legal aid, particularly for women. And it's notable that even the government's own equality assessment report conceded that women would be disproportionately impacted by the removal of legal aid, virtually wholesale. This is because women, for many reasons, are much more reliant on legal aid than men. And this is particularly so with my client group, the migrant women, the minority women, women with disabilities, all women who are intersectionally impacted. What LASPO effectively did was remove from women their access to their equality rights, because if you have no means of fighting to get your rights back when they're taken away from you, then they are in reality meaningless. It's just fundamental. We were delighted in 2013, we got a devastating determination against the government about equality before the law, about legal aid and about violence against women, which we were then able to use against cases that we brought for judicial review against the government, in which we made several attempts to roll back the impact of the LASPO Act on women's access to justice in all areas. It's an ongoing battle, and I was reminded only yesterday by one of my colleagues from Rau, who took part in one of those cases with me, that we've now been working on working groups with the Ministry of Justice to improve women's access to legal aid, particularly victims of all forms of abuse, since 2016. And the essential statutory guidelines have still to be laid before Parliament. We even drafted the statutory guidelines for them, and it's immensely frustrating. And days like today are really essential because they give us all that community, that strength, and that spirit to keep going. LASPO was part of a whole host of austerity measures which brought in savage cuts for well over a decade, and these have impacted every aspect of the services that are there to uphold our rights. the police cuts, the court closures, the refuges and the domestic abuse services that have had their funding cut, the women's sector as a whole. And it's no surprise that women and children are bearing the inevitable brunt of the damage that that has done. We now need to be able to enforce our rights as we never have before. There are no resources currently being put into the massive gap in provisions that's been left by the decade of austerity. In fact, the CEDAW 2019 determination against the government was clear that it endorsed the 2013 requirements, which have still not been met, and it went further. It made it clear to the government that without massive financial investment to stop the decline, initiatives such as Domestic Abuse Act will be ineffective in what they purport to provide for victims of abuse. This is an audacious motion, and it's an essential one, because it comes at a time when we have a government that's determined to take away even more of our human rights and to repeal the Human Rights Act. I commend this fight, and I commend the fight to keep the human rights that we have, to enhance them, to save them, because I really, really fear that once we lose them, we'll never get them back. It's International Women's Day, as we've mentioned, and I'd like to quote the wonderful Just Phillips MP, who will be reading in Parliament this morning the names of all of those women who've been murdered by men over the last year. This morning she said, on International Women's Day 2022, always be wary of those asking you to be grateful for the basics that you should have been able to expect and take for granted. Be demanding, be pissed off. We weren't put here to demur gracefully for the bare minimum. Thank you all for listening. I fully support this motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris Mccurley. And now we would go to Jackie Davis, who can't be here, but she asked me to read for her. I am sorry I'm not with you in person. I wanted to be, but also at heart feel relief. In talking about climate change, especially in relation to how it affects women, I am talking about trauma. Trauma is wordless. In its raw state, it cannot be spoken. To say what I want to say live and before a microphone would be difficult for me now, but I want it to be said, and so I'm taking the safest option with a narrative. When I offered to speak for 5 minutes on this subject, I was thinking of the statistics I knew of the lives lost in the tsunami of the Indian Ocean in 2004. Distance in time and family connection made it relatively. Then, in that sudden, dreadful flood, 4 times as many women lost their lives as men. Why? There were more women near the water's edge that day. Women with children and who ran into the water towards their children. Women whose clothing made it difficult for them to swim or run or climb. Women who had culturally not been encouraged to swim or to climb. Women who were not prepared. There was little warning. This last week, however, another dreadful flooding event is unfolding. It has not had the publicity it warrants because on this side of the world, we are understandably taken up with the deadly invasion of Ukraine. But locals on Twitter in the area are likening it to the Hurricane Katrina. It's terrible. Australia's east coast is reeling from the worst floods in living memory. Lismore in New South Wales is the worst affected. It has a levee to safeguard the small city from 12-metre high water, but a week ago it reached 14.4 metres. That is pretty much as high as the top of the escalators in the Grand Arcade here in Cambridge. Picture St Neots town centre flooded to that height. Lismore has a slightly higher population than St Neots. The city went underwater. 14,000 residents are homeless. People were rescued from rooftops. Cows were rescued from rooftops. Bodies were slowly discovered as the water went down. The reason I am reluctant to talk outright about this is because this is where my daughter, her partner, and the little daughters live and love it. They were lucky. Their house had only a giant mudslide, but my granddaughter's school has gone, along with almost every other building they know. It may be the first Australian city to be lost because of climate change. Politicians call it a rain bomb. Meteorologists call it an atmospheric river caused by rising sea temperatures. But did many more women than men drown in this catastrophic flood? So far, it seems not. One of the reasons is the different responses to risk that are displayed between men and women. Women are naturally inclined to be risk averse, not necessarily. In the bushfires, since records began in Australia, fewer women lost their lives, although the statistics are now levelling up. Faced with sufficient warnings, they took their children and elderly relatives to safety, and it was men who stayed to protect property and were more likely to perish. As with floods, women are still more likely to pack up and move out. So what we have seen in video footage and newscast is Lismore is brave men in their tin boats, they call them tinnies, and against official advice, risking fast-moving water, underwater trees and live cables to rescue women and children and older people from rooftops. In a WhatsApp, my daughter says, "Gotta say, in my gender analysis of this situation, the men are doing an incredible job." But watch carefully at any video footage and consider what is happening to women. Time and again, we see women on rooftops, clutching babies and children, being rescued in tinnies, the tin boats, and taken to Lismore Bridge to be transferred to a vehicle to take them to one of the 12 evacuation points. Their babies and toddlers are not grizzling or bawling. To grizzle or bawl is a healthy response. These babies are silent and watchful. That's trauma. And the mothers clutching these infants may have a grateful smile of relief, or it may be a fixed rictus of a smile, there instinctively for the child's peace of mind. It's okay, I will keep you safe. But as the floods recede, the trauma remains. For months or for years, the future is bleak. Secure housing, well-paid secure employment, paid time off for childcare when nurseries or schools are closed may be completely out of reach. Exploitation of vulnerable women is commonplace. Women are disproportionately low-waged and dependent on friends and welfare. And women have not only to deal with their own mental health, but it falls primarily to them to manage the mental health of children and not just their own children. The mental health services in and around Lismore supporting women and families have done a brilliant job during bushfires and evacuations, the pandemic, and now are faced with the impact of climate change flooding. I asked my daughter what was the gender composition of her mental health team. 8 women and 1 man. It's an essential, highly skilled, caring and supportive job that attracts more women than men. Many of the essential workers are homeless themselves. We haven't yet had flooding or coastal erosion or landslip or fires here in the United Kingdom on the horrific scale of some countries. The fires in Australia last year, if they'd happened here, would have spread from Dover, from the English Channel up to the Scots border. The entire country would have been aflame That's what happened there. It can happen here. We are not ready for it. And I don't think we have acknowledged that we need a thoughtful, gender-aware response to it. We need to make certain we get it. And so I support the motion. Jackie Davis. Thank you, Jackie Davis. And now we turn to Hannah Murphy. Thank you, Hannah Murphy.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Hello, everyone. I support the notion, and I would like to say thank you for having me here today. It's been such a privilege to be here with all of you, inspirational women. All of your talks have been so interesting and informative. So now I'm going to talk to you about psychology. Psychology affects everything we do in some capacity, but it's often overlooked because we focus on outcomes and behaviours rather than cognitive functions behind what we see. I would love to talk to you about this in great detail, but today I'm going to talk to you about a select few processes involved in how we make decisions, which ultimately affect our lives as well as other people's. We make decisions every day about all sorts of things. Some of those are insignificant. However, some could be very important. Sometimes we might go as far as to write a pros and cons list. However, we don't usually take time to consider what influences how we think and how we reach the decisions that we make. Research suggests we have both conscious and unconscious biases, and to make things easier, we use stereotypes. The concept of cognitive bias was first introduced by researchers Tversky and Kahneman in 1972. Since then, researchers have described a number of different types of biases that affect our decision making and our understanding of the world. A conscious bias is when we're aware of a biased attitude about a certain group. We know we're being biased and we do it intentionally. These conscious biases can be seen in behaviours, decisions and choices people actively choose to show us and are part of areas that many of you have addressed today. Our unconscious biases are a little more dangerous. They are biased attitudes operating outside of our awareness and control. These are difficult to access or be aware of, but they influence our actions and behaviour more than our conscious biases do. We may not be aware that we hold biased attitudes towards things until our ideas, our decisions and our attitudes are challenged by other people or new information. Our unconscious biases usually don't contain any malicious intentions, but they can't always easily be observed or explained because we're not always aware of them. So we don't realise that our behaviour is constantly influenced by such biases. They are influenced by social factors and our lived experience. However, if this is the case, research might suggest that our unconscious bias could actually be susceptible and influenced by education and new experiences. If people are aware of the way they've understood and processed information, they may be able to take a step back and consider another person's perspective, which would consider all available information in order to reach an optimal decision for everybody. Unconscious cognitive biases influence people by causing them to rely on our expected observations and our previous knowledge, while dismissing information and observation that could be perceived as uncertain, unreliable, or unfamiliar. As this mainly happens unconsciously and very quickly, without considering the bigger picture or taking into account other information, occasionally we might see a decision made on an unconscious bias. People refer to such decisions as being based on their gut instincts. We may be confident when we rely on our gut instincts sometimes, but this may lead to poor decisions. In hindsight, we might reflect on the information we didn't consider at the time because when we made a decision, we could have only considered the outcomes from our own perspective, which of course is influenced by our cognitive schemas and our cognitive bias. We understand good behaviour is reinforced and bad behaviour is punished or avoided. We know good decisions are repeated due to positive outcomes. This is supported in psychology research from Juliusson et al. 2005, who suggested past decisions influence the decisions people make in the future, and from Sagi and Freudland in 2007, who explained that bad decisions are avoided because of negative previous outcomes. In regard to cognitive bias, this could eventually lead to a confirmation bias, which is the tendency to favour information that aligns with our existing beliefs and attitudes in order to come to another decision. Each of us also have a variety of cognitive biases based on our own experiences and observation. They are a result of our brain's attempt to simplify information processing and to help us make sense of the world, which enables us to reach decisions quickly. And these are influenced by our memory and our attention. Julison et al. In 2005 suggested that individuals invest larger amounts of time, money and effort into a decision they feel committed to making. This suggests that the more confident we feel, the more determined we will be in enforcing what we think is right. Given this information, we can see how cognitive bias may impact on important decisions, things that not only affect us, but other people too. We may not have any awareness of what we think may not be right. It may not always be correct. It may not always be based on available information. Our decisions could be solely based on what we assume to be correct because of how we've interpreted things. Research also suggests that individual differences may influence decision making. It has indicated that age, cognitive abilities, and socioeconomic status, as well as influences from people around us, influence our own decision making. Funny-Kane in 2005 established a significant difference in decision making across age, and it suggested that compared to younger people, older people might be overconfident regarding their ability to make decisions. Furthermore, there is evidence to support the notion that older adults prefer fewer choices than younger adults. This shows as we age, we increase our levels of confidence to make our own decisions, and we prefer to make these based on fewer choices. This paired with prior knowledge and previous experiences may cause an overconfidence in our own decisions and a reluctance to think outside the box and take things from another person's perspective. So from this, we know when people believe what they decide matters, they are more likely to make a decision and stand by it. This should be considered, especially by those who make decisions that will ultimately affect other people. As well as having individual cognitive biases, we also stereotype in order to make quick and what we think are effective decisions. A definition of stereotyping explains that a stereotype can be positive or negative, but it's when we overgeneralise and apply it to all members of a group. Occasionally, stereotypes represent an oversimplified opinion or a prejudiced attitude or a snap judgment. Today, I have a few common stereotypes as examples. We frequently hear people say that women are bad drivers, particular jobs are women's work, and women are the weaker sex. These are all examples of stereotypes and overgeneralizations applied to all members of a group, in this instance, all women. We might argue that these examples show prejudiced attitudes and are based on snap judgments, and that they are accepted and joked about within society with little to no evidence. Kaufman in 2019 found that these stereotypes can impact women's confidence in their own abilities, however untrue they may be. These stereotypes are rife because it's simply so easy to make quick, snap, thoughtless judgments, and not because there is any reflection of truth in the aforementioned examples. In regards to making decisions, we can see from these examples it's relatively simple to make a snap judgment and apply the stereotype to explain behaviours, especially with other people, as it attempts to make sense of a lot of information quickly. When we have some awareness and understanding of how we reach decisions, we realise the conclusion we reach may not be informed or correct. So with little or no awareness about how stereotypes work, we may find we do this ourselves. We may not consider that all of our decisions or beliefs are based on reality. The decisions we reach may not be correct for other people due to our own cognitive bias and stereotyping. As I mentioned earlier, we may not be aware that we hold biased attitudes towards certain things until our ideas, decisions and attitudes are challenged by new knowledge or other people. Understanding this may mean we're more considerate to the reasons others have made decisions, which in hindsight may not have been very good decisions, but could be based on immediate situations and environments. Being aware of cognitive bias and stereotyping in decision-making could be particularly relevant to judges and influential members of court. A difference in lived experience, socio-economical status and education may mean they have different unconscious and conscious biases compared to those who stand before them. And this could mean that they may not always understand why a particular decision was made. It would simply seem as if somebody is either good or bad because we stereotype people to groups with similarities, so it could be assumed that they knew right from wrong, so they should have acted accordingly. We think they may have chose to make poor decisions because they wanted to, because they ignored right from wrong. Such stereotypes may influence the outcomes of offenders' sentences and differences in sentencing times. These stereotypes may affect different genders, different races and different classes in different ways, and I'm sure each of you can think of many examples that we haven't got time to discuss in detail today, so I'm just going to highlight one. But as we know, there is a common stereotype around the reporting, the attitude and the sentencing of rapists. It's a common stereotype that women are asking for it because they have been friendly and kind, because they have worn certain outfits, or because they're drinking alcohol. Apparently, all stereotypical reasons as to why it's the women's fault if she is sexually abused or raped. And finally, I'll bring us back to our general lives. We need to be aware of cognitive bias and stereotyping, because it's relevant to everybody who overhears discussions of common stereotypes which undermine women, people joining in a funny conversation with a throwaway remark, or attributing a poor driving experience to the fact it's a woman driver. We're actively undermining women's own confidence in their own abilities, even accidentally, thoughtlessly, and unintentionally. We are all ultimately enforcing prevalent stereotypes, which could later lead to snap judgment and decisions that may not affect us, but it may affect other women. So for that, I commend this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah Murphy. And leading on from this, I'd just like to say that in 1977, the Women's Electoral Lobby draft bill on rape and other sexual offences incorporated a provision that when the new law went through, it should have an explicit statement that judges and those operating in the courts must be trained effectively in relation to those provisions. That was 1977. In the year 2021, the Canadian Parliament put a provision in their Rape and Sexual Offences Act to that very effect. So it took 40 years for them to get the message that judges need to have their brains opened up to what the realities are of women's lives and what the realities are of rape and other sexual offences. And that follows in relation to this motion that we have here today, that it contains the proposition that judges and all those involved in the justice system, and that every elected member of a parliament or a local government must have training in the Women's Bill of Rights too. Now, we come to the conclusion of this event, and in the ordinary terms, one person would second a motion, because that's how in the ordinary arena seconding is considered. But because this is a women's parliament, and because we believe that it's important that every woman's voice must be heard, because there are two aspects to silence. One is silence when persons do not speak, but so often that the other sort of silence is what happens, and it's that women's voices are not heard. So I will ask everyone to rise or to remain in their seats if they wish, and simply to say, I second the motion, so that every single one of us here will be seconding the motion for a Women's Bill of Rights. Thank you. Let's stand. I second the motion.
I second the motion.
Thank you. And let me just simply conclude with these final remarks. It comes from Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was made the second woman on the Supreme Court of the United States. And what she said, and we remember that this applies to us too in our realm. I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of women and men who kept dreams of equal citizenship alive in days when few would listen. People like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Tubman come to mind. I stand on the shoulders of those brave people. We too stand on their shoulders. We stand on the shoulders of Emily Davies, Patricia Fawcett, Vida Goldstein, May Gibbs, Pat Eatock, Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, Christine de Pizan, and all the millions of women who fought in this struggle that we are fighting today for a Women's Bill of Rights. Thank you everyone, thank you.
To make a vote of thanks today. What a fascinating variety we've heard this morning. I have enjoyed them all, but for different reasons. So thank you, all of you, and in particular to Jocelyn Scott,
for her planning and enabling this Women's Parliament to take place and to make this such a memorable occasion on International Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thanks.